meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 42, which is the answer to life, the universe, and everything, if people know, of the House of Commons Special Committee on the Canada People's Republic of China relationship. Pursuant to the order of reference of May 16, 2022, the committee is meeting on its study of the Canada People's Republic of China relations. Before we begin, I'd like to remind all members and other in-person participants to consult the cards on the table for guidelines. We need to prevent audio feedback incidents because that's been very injurious to some of our translators. We've had a few incidents, very serious ones, in fact. So only use the approved black earpiece. Keep it away from the microphone. Putting it on the little decal on the desk is a good distance away. And when you're not using your earpiece, just put it face down and, as I say, far away from the microphone. So we thank you for your cooperation there. Now, today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Please wait till I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, you can click on the microphone icon to activate your mic and mute yourself when you're not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, of course, you have the little globe at the bottom of your screen that you can use to select a language of your choice. For those in the room, of course, use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand, especially for our witnesses who may have something to add to a particular answer or a reflection. Just raise your hand and we'll do our best to recognize you as quickly as possible. So with that, I'd like to actually welcome Mr. Majinder, who's sitting in for Tom Kimmich, and welcome Mr. Couric, who's now, I think, a permanent member of the committee. Ms. McPherson has opted, under no duress at all, to be virtual, and we have other people virtual as well. So it's good to have you all here. So let's welcome our witnesses for today's first panel. From the Canadian Agri-Food and Trade Alliance, Michael Harvey, Executive Director. From the Canadian Canola Growers Association, Dave Carey, Vice President, Government and Industry Relations. From the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Jeff Kucharski, Senior Fellow by video conference. And from Soy Canada, Brian Innes, Executive Director. Now, we normally provide 5 minutes for opening statements, but we'll ask you to keep tight to time because there's quite a number of statements to be made, and we want to leave lots of time for questions. So who would like to start? Shall we start with you, Mr. Harvey? 5 minutes or less?
Okay. Bonsoir et merci aux membres du comité. Good evening and thank you to members of the committee for inviting me here today. The Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance is a coalition of national organizations that advocates for a freer and fairer international trading environment for the agriculture and agri-food sector. Paragraphs for the time. CAFTA members have established the following priorities for our work. First, to open new markets for Canadian agri-food. This includes prioritizing trade liberalization discussions with growing emerging markets in the Indo-Pacific, like Indonesia and ASEAN countries. To uphold the international rules-based trading system. A delegation of CAFTA members attended the WTO's recent ministerial conference in Abu Dhabi. We witnessed firsthand the challenges the system is facing, and we support Canada's efforts through the Ottawa Group to advance key priorities at the WTO. To strengthen trade diplomacy capacity and industry-government collaboration. We welcome the opening of the Indo-Pacific Agriculture and Agri-Food Office in Manila, and CAFTA is co-chairing the industry working group that is ensuring alignment between government and stakeholders. The Indo-Pacific region currently accounts for over 1/3 of the world's economic activity, and in 2023, Canada's agriculture and agri-food exports to the region reached $22.8 billion. In 2021, Canada was ranked the 7th largest agri-food and seafood supplier to China, with values of $11.7 billion, or 3.5% of market share. China's top agri-food and seaport imports from Canada were canola seeds, canola oil, and barley. China is our second largest market for agri-food exports. CAFTA strongly supported the opening of the Manila office because we believe Canadian business will benefit from more sustained Canadian engagement in the Indo-Pacific. Culturally, it is essential to have Canadian representatives on the ground to develop personal relationships. CAFTA members travel regularly to the region and have seen the need to have permanent representation on the ground. It is essential that the office have the technical expertise needed to manage relationships with local authorities to help prevent the emergence of non-tariff barriers that can keep Canadian product out of market. It's also important to note that our agri-food competitors are also very present in the Indo-Pacific region. The U.S. and Australia are particularly engaged, have strong infrastructure on the ground, and have developed solid relationships with local buyers. I wish to underline to committee members that exporting food responds not just to Canada's economic interest, but also to our national security interest of making an important contribution to international peace and security. Canada is the world's 5th largest agri-food exporter. We're one of the few countries in the world producing enough food for ourselves while at the same time feeding others around the world. We contribute to international peace and stability by feeding the hungry, especially at a time of international instability when major grain producers are at war. Canada also has a strong track record of not using food as a political weapon or banning agricultural exports. That helps make us a more reliable supplier to countries seeking greater food security. En résumé, il est dans l'intérêt économique.
In summary, it is in Canada's economic and national interest to increase our agri-food exports to the Indo-Pacific region. This requires consistent, long-term investment in commercial relations with buyers and national authorities. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harvey. Now we'll go to Mr. Carey from the Canadian Canola Growers Association.
Thank you for the invitation to appear before this special committee. The Canadian Canola Growers, or CCGA, is the National Association for Canada's 43,000 canola farmers, representing them on issues, policies, and programs that impact their farm success. Developed in Canada, canola is a staple of Canadian agriculture as well as science and innovation. Canola is a strong economic contributor to family farms and rural communities. Canola is the number one revenue source of farmers, earning Canadian farmers $13.7 billion in 2023. Canadian canola exports were valued at $15.8 billion in 2023, with 90% of this crop exported as seed, oil, or meal. Annually, the canola sector contributes $29.9 billion to the Canadian economy and provides for 200,000 jobs. The Indo-Pacific region is a critical area for growth and development for the export of Canadian canola, seed, oil, and meal. Of greatest importance in the region for canola is China. Canada exports canola seed, oil, and meal to China, making it the second most important market for Canadian canola farmers. The main exports in recent years are seed and canola meal. In 2023, Canada exported nearly 4.6 million metric tons of canola seed to China, the second highest export to date, making it the most important seed market. Canola meal exports to China are becoming increasingly important, with 1.8 million metric tons exported in 2023, for a total value of canola exports to China in 2023 of $5 billion. The canola industry is set to grow, both in terms of total canola yield, as well as the volume of canola that is processed in Canada into oil and meal. Increased canola processing in Canada could generate potential 3 million metric tons of additional canola meal. While canola oil is seeing high demand as a feedstock of renewable fuel production in North America, the additional canola meal volume produced will need to continue to find high-value markets. China's high demand for protein ingredients, as well as plans to diversify its vegetable protein sources for livestock feed, position canola meal well within the market. In addition, China's growing dairy industry and canola meal is a proven ingredient to support increased milk production. In addition to China, the Indo-Pacific region holds opportunity for canola products to be valued and in high demand. Countries of interest for Canadian canola farmers within the region include Bangladesh, Indonesia, Japan, Pakistan, Philippines, South Korea, Thailand, and Vietnam. Japan is a consistent and loyal buyer of Canadian canola, with strong ties between our two countries that support reliable trade. Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, and Philippines all represent markets of interest for canola meal. These countries have growing feed markets and increasing demand for vegetable protein ingredients. South Korea has also been a consistent importer of canola oil over the past decade. Canadian canola farmers grow a high-value crop that is in demand around the globe. Within the Indo-Pacific region, China remains a critical market for importance to farmers, with the industry committed to fostering and expanding this trading relationship. In addition, we see value in the work the Canadian government and our fellow associations are doing to expand market opportunities within the Indo-Pacific region that are aligned with the growth of our industry. The newly opened first-of-its-kind Indo-Pacific Agriculture and Agri-Food Office in Manila will play a key role in market access, reducing trade disruptions, and likely assist in ongoing free trade agreement negotiations with ASEAN and Indonesia. Look forward to your questions, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carey. Now we'll turn to Brian Innes from Soy Canada for 5 minutes or less.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'm here representing Canada's soybean industry. So that includes Canadian seed developers, that includes our farmers, that includes our processors and our exporters. We have a very diverse industry that spans the production from Atlantic Canada all the way to the Rocky Mountains. Soybeans are the third most valuable crop here in Canada, with exports worth about $3.5 billion per year. We produce world-leading food-grade soybeans to make things like tofu and soy milk, but also commodity soybeans to make meal to feed livestock and oil for humans and biofuel. With more than 70% of our production exported every year, we're very, very focused on global markets. And before I describe why the Indo-Pacific strategy is important for us, I'd like to share why the region itself presents an opportunity. From a soybean perspective, the Indo-Pacific is the heartbeat of global demand. Take the ASEAN region, for example, which excludes other important markets like Japan, China, and Korea. ASEAN imports approximately $9 billion worth of soybeans every year, and our Canadian exports are about $470 million into this region. We see a lot of opportunity for growth. So, for example, the USDA sees demand for soybeans in ASEAN to grow by 25% now through 2028. And with the committee's focus on China, it's also important to recognize that China is the world's biggest importer of soybeans, demanding 60% of all the soybeans traded in the world. It's also a very important market for Canadian soybean producers and industry. So the question facing us today is how the Indo-Pacific strategy can help us seize these opportunities in the Indo-Pacific. For our sector, this will happen by helping to improve access to these markets. First, we need to eliminate tariffs and establish mechanisms of regulatory cooperation through the Canada-Indonesia free trade negotiations. Eliminating tariffs would create growth opportunities and predictability. So, for example, right now, Indonesia could raise their tariffs on soybeans to 27%. But eliminating tariffs is not enough. We also need to address non-tariff barriers like sanitary and phytosanitary issues. Things that can suddenly appear, can create costs, and can even stop trade. Second, we need to continue engaging all countries in the region among our shared interest in stable food trade. As my colleague Michael shared, Canada is one of the few countries that can produce food for itself as well as others. Our agri-food sector is an engine of growth, and for our customers in the Indo-Pacific, they depend on what we produce to feed their people and their animals. And what we come to produce comes from what we invest, and what we invest is highly influenced by predictability. So it's in everyone's interest to support rules-based trade and to continue engagement that supports stable food trade. Lastly, we need to make the most of the newly established Indo-Pacific Agri-Food Office under the strategy to work proactively to prevent trade issues and also to address them quickly when they arise. We welcome the office as an important tool to prevent and resolve trade issues. And the exciting part is we're already seeing it work. We're already seeing that engagement help bring more collaboration and cooperation between governments. One way we're seeing this is by regulators connecting with their counterparts. They're connecting to discuss plant health issues so that they can better understand how governments can regulate these things to prevent trade risk, connecting to improve understanding so that small regulatory differences on how weed seeds are regulated don't create trade barriers. So as we look to the future, we see the office as a really helpful tool that can help with new technologies too, like seed technologies such as gene editing. So throughout the region, regulations are evolving, though often not in sync with what's happening here in Canada. So investing in more collaboration between Canadian and Indo-Pacific regulators can really help minimize differences that can create trade barriers or regulations that are not based on sciences. Je vous remercie de m'avoir permis.
I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy and how it can help us to seize growth opportunities in the region of the Indo-Pacific, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Innes. We'll now turn to Mr. Kucharski from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute for 5 minutes or less, sir.
Mr. Chair, thank you for the opportunity to address your committee today. I would like to make a few remarks on Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy by first talking about the external environment which we now face, and then make some observations about the strategy itself. First of all, in my view, the IPS is probably the most significant, comprehensive, and ambitious strategic document on the Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific region that the Canadian government has ever issued. It comes at a time when the rules-based international order is being increasingly challenged by China, Russia, and other authoritarian regimes. Consequently, the link between economic security and national security has become increasingly critical to Western nations, including Canada. Canada has a huge stake in maintaining peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. In 2022, Canada's total trade with the region was $270 billion, or about 18% of Canada's total global trade. Much of this trade goes by maritime vessel through contentious waters, South and East China Seas, so any disruptions in that area could have devastating consequences for Canada and our allies. Yet the Indo-Pacific strategy will not live or die based solely on Canada's relations with China. Canada's trade with China represented only about 8.5% of Canada's total trade in 2022, but the balance of trade is heavily in China's favor. Their exports to Canada, over $100 billion, are more than 3 times what they import from Canada. Given the realities we face with a rising China, it's in Canada's interest to be more pragmatic and transactional with China, while prioritizing and broadening our economic and security relations with allies like Japan and South Korea, as well as pursuing deeper economic ties with ASEAN nations and Taiwan. While the IPS itself is quite comprehensive, it does have a few gaps and shortcomings in my view. One issue is that it appears to be where there's a gap is between Canada's commitment to multilateralism and the realities Canada is faced with in the world. A host of minilateral groupings have sprung up in the Indo-Pacific to address urgent and/or unique regional economic and security issues. While Canada is a member of the CPTPP, it has been left out of other fora, such as the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and security partnerships such as the Australia, UK, US, or AUKUS partnership. A strategy to address Canada's participation in these and other minilaterals is not addressed in the IPS. Also, while the strategy acknowledges that the North Pacific faces growing security challenges, there's no reference at all to Russia in the strategy. Russia is also an Indo-Pacific nation and a regional security concern and poses threats to Canada in the longer term, especially in the Arctic. With regard to trade, the Indo-Pacific strategy notably aims to position Canada as a responsible and reliable energy security partner, but makes no mention of Canada's hydrocarbon resources, even though Canada is an environmentally responsible, world-scale producer. In fact, the first tanker carrying the Trans Mountain Pipeline's first shipment of crude oil to Asia left Burnaby just last Wednesday. Next year should see LNG Canada's project come online. Canada will then be in a position to help the region lower its coal emissions. The IPS emphasizes clean energy, which is fine, but hydrocarbons are in demand in the region now and likely will be for decades. All of Canada's energy resources should play a part in leveraging Canada's position in the region, so in my view, this is a significant oversight. Ultimately, the effectiveness and success of the IPS will depend on 2 things. The first is how the U.S. views our commitment to the region, which is to say, are we prioritizing national security and defense as well as trade and economics? U.S. concerns with Canada's failure to meet our NATO commitments have been made all too clear in the past few days on this issue. Meeting our defense commitments at a time when threats are growing is essential to being taken seriously when it comes to being seen as a partner in the region and being invited to join regional fora. The second key factor is Canada's ability to achieve the goals in the IPS. Much will depend on the strength of Canada's economy and the ability to actually execute on the strategy. Unfortunately, Canada's share of global exports is falling, manufactured exports are stagnating, and our GDP is underperforming our peers. Canada also needs to urgently address the inadequacies and supports for Canada's foreign service and the personnel, readiness, and funding issues plaguing the military. Thus, there are real concerns about Canada's capacity to deliver over the longer term. I don't want to leave you with the impression that I'm critical or pessimistic. In fact, quite the opposite. My main concern is with follow-through and ensuring the strategy is properly resourced and effectively implemented, as I believe its success is an essential component for Canada's long-term prosperity and security. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Mr. Kucharski. We'll now go to our first round of questioning, which will be first Mr. Couric, then Mr. Oliphant. Mr. Perron is going to be joining us, and Mr. Bergeron will be ceding his time to him. And, of course, Ms. McPherson will round up our first round of questioning. So, Mr. Couric, the first to you for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. I think it's self-evident that Canada needs trade and that we should be, and I would suggest can be, the supplier of choice. And in particular, I look at the three gentlemen here when it comes to our agricultural sector. And yet, it seems to be that when it comes to our place, we don't seem to be growing as fast as certainly we could be. And I would suggest, and I would ask the question, the reason why I ask this question is because it's important when this committee compiles a report. So my question to the three gentlemen here at the end of the table is the method to which we transport our goods primarily to Asia would be what? If I could just go down the table, starting with Mr. Harvey, then Mr. Carey, and then Mr. Hines.
I mean, after leaving Canada by ship?
Mr. Carey?
Rail to port.
Mr. Hines?
And for soybeans, we're transporting in containers as well as transporting in bulk. We use a lot of containers, approximately 40,000 every year to export our soybeans.
And those would primarily go through?
Port of Montreal, Port of Halifax, Port of Prince Rupert, and Port of Vancouver.
Okay. So when it comes to specifically the Indo-Pacific, we have one major port, and although I know that there's a lot of conversations that, in fact, that I've had with some of your organizations about expanding that, but I'm looking at a copy the World Bank had S&P do a report on port efficiencies. And I know my Liberal colleagues like to talk about S&P a lot, so I hope they'll note this in particular. And in the context of this report, the Port of Vancouver ranks, you can see it highlighted there, 347 out of 348 when it comes to port efficiency. So to the witnesses here at the end of the table, is that concerning in terms of Canada's potential when we are ranked so low when it comes to efficiencies of such a critical part of Canada's transportation infrastructure, which is essential to making sure that your members, those involved with your organizations, and the many producers that you all represent are able to get their products to market? We'll start with Mr. Harvey, and we'll keep it fairly short. But
Working more on ports on a daily basis than me.
Okay, Mr. Carey.
Absolutely. I think Canada needs to get back in the business of nation building. We see if capacity is needed in the United States at Long Beach, they move heaven and earth regardless of party in power at the time. 7 out of 10 tons of grains grown in the prairies by farmers and many of your constituents, it goes through the Port of Vancouver still. We have one bridge that gets in the Port of Vancouver. We have one tunnel. And I know discussions with the city of Burnaby are 5 years now into improving some of the basic grade issues around railway passing. So it is a concern that is our gateway to the economic prosperity in Asia.
And I appreciate that. And move heaven and earth, I think, is a key phrase there, because you're absolutely right. We need to be a country that builds and actually gets things done. And it's regrettable that over the last 9 years or so that has not been the case. And just a shout out to my father, who's actually on the tractor right now. He said he's got a little over 1,000 acres of canola left to seed before we moved oats. So, Mr. Hines, you wanted to answer that.
Yes, thank you. So we export our soybeans in containers in bulk shipments. And to build on what my colleague said, predictability and reliability and cost competitiveness for Canadian shippers is paramount to our competitiveness. So in the soybean industry, we compete head-to-head with our American counterparts. And so when they have better service, when they have better rates, all of which comes from infrastructure as well as thinking about competition of the three global alliances that control the container market, for example, these are actions taken by government that have real impact on the shippers and our competitiveness that allows us to bring value here to Canada.
So when it comes to competitiveness, I'm glad you brought that up, because Canada, of course, pays a carbon tax, and while so that has an in particular and disproportionate effect on the transportation sector, specifically rail, which you all mentioned that it's important for commodities to get from the farm, which is generally by truck, to a inland port, which would then go from on rail to a major port, and then from the port to wherever in the world. The carbon tax. Does that have an impact on Canada's competitiveness to be able to get our products to market? I'll start with Mr. Irons, then Mr. Carey, and then Mr. Harvey. Go ahead.
I think Mr. Carey is best placed to speak to this.
Sure, Mr. Carey.
It does. My organization has been a proponent of Bill C-234 since its inception. That would alleviate the carbon pricing on a farm. However, every time the price of carbon goes up, whether that's rail, whether that's inputs, custom haul trucking, that all gets passed down to the farmer in many ways. So farmers are saying that their major, for canola, we have 60% of the world trade is Canada, but Australia is our largest competitor. They're much closer to markets, and they do not have a carbon tax. So anything that takes money out of the farmers' pockets to reinvest in their operations does impact our ability to compete with places like the United States, Australia, and South America.
No, and I appreciate that, and I hope my Liberal colleagues are watching, because quite often they say, oh, well, because you get money back, therefore everything's a wash, but it's that impact that it has on competitiveness that is very significant, and 234 does address, at least in its original form, a key part of that, but you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying that it's so much more than that in terms of the impact on the sector as a whole. Am I correct in that?
Yes, 234 is only for on-farm activities related to natural gas and propane use. However, all the costs that we all see as normal Canadians, as well as transportation costs.
And sorry to interrupt, just in my last 10 seconds, all of you, if you could quick answer, can Canada grow its place in the world when it comes to agricultural exports? Yes or no? Mr. Irons, Mr. Carey, and Mr. Harvey.
Absolutely.
100%.
Yes.
Thank you.
Right on time, Mr. Craig. Well done, sir. All right, we'll go to Mr. Oliphant for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to all the guests for being witnesses today with us. I'm not a trade person and I'm not a farmer. I eat food, so I care about what you do, but I really am going to ask some questions that may sound dumb. I want to talk about where Mr. Kirk ended up around growing the markets. And given the numbers you're talking about in terms of the billions of dollars of exports we are now doing in the agri-food business, like canola, soy, and others, how does that market grow? Is that growing because we're better than our competitors, or is the market itself growing and we want a greater share of a new market? I just don't, I'm kind of interested in that to know. And then secondly, who are our competitors? You've mentioned the United States, you've mentioned Australia in different ways, but so first of all, the growth of the market, does it come from expanded consumption, or does it come from stealing or getting or earning a larger share of the markets that we're talking about? And then secondly, who are our competitors, and how does the IPS perhaps help us to strategically position ourselves vis-a-vis either a growing market or competitors? And why don't we start with soy, and then we can go to canola, then generally agri-food.
Yeah, thanks for the question. When we look at the Indo-Pacific especially, they're a region that needs protein and a region that needs oil. So the demand growth that we're seeing in soy for the two products that come from soy, oil and protein, are really coming because we're seeing population growth, we're seeing income growth, and we're seeing shifting diets that are really growing the market for plant-based proteins, for example. So growing more demand for soy milk, growing more demand for soy products, whether it's tofu or tempeh in Indonesia, for example. So when we look at that growth opportunity, it's all the above. It's more people, more income, changing diets. When we look at the competition we face, in food-grade soybeans, for example, Canada is a major player. The other major player in the world is the U.S. So we're about a third of the market, and the U.S. is most of the rest. So when we see competition, it really comes down to how we're able to produce a value-added product that provides the most value to our customer and the ecosystem that supports our ability to do that, as well as being competitive in the real things that we do, whether that's planting, moving, processing, and exporting.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'd echo my colleague's comments, and perhaps I'll save the competitor side for my colleague Michael Harvey. It's a good question because despite rising export numbers, those are not bankable and not necessarily repeatable every year. We're dealing right now with global conflicts, which are leading to increased commodity prices. So in 2023, actually, we had a smaller canola crop because of droughts in Saskatchewan and other situations. So we have an opportunity to grow. As my colleague Brian said, there's a growing middle class, growing incomes that demanding different products. However, banking on the fact that we export almost $98 billion of agriculture products next year does not mean that we can necessarily repeat that year after year. If we're not reliable in our delivery of our products to global markets, other markets will go elsewhere. So we're in a good place, but we can't rest on our laurels.
Yeah, I'd say the main reason why the market is increasing is because the number of people on the planet is increasing, and then because the number of people in the planet who are eating better, who have moved into the middle class, are moving into the middle class, are moving up the chain, is increasing. So, as was mentioned, a lot more protein, but more calories in general, and higher quality calories. In terms of competitors, we already talked about the U.S., Australia. I'd also mention countries like Brazil and Argentina. I mean, the big agri-food exporters are countries that have a lot of land and have a lot of water. South America produces a lot of products that compete with ours globally.
Excellent. Mr. Carey, you mentioned drought last year. I know that there are droughts and periods that are up and down. Can you explain to me the impact of climate change and what is happening about climate change and how farmers are having to deal with this? And this could be in canola, it could be in soy, or more generally in agri-food. I am feeling it. I'm just wondering how farmers are dealing with it.
Yeah, I mean, farmers are at the forefront whenever there's significant changes. We had significant droughts in the prairies, particularly Saskatchewan last year, where our canola production was down to 18.3 million tons. If it wasn't for advances, as my colleague Brian alluded to earlier, in seed technology, some of those farmers would have been relying solely on crop insurance. But because of advances in research and development, increases in drought tolerance with crops like canola, soybeans, corn, etc., they were able to get off a decent-sized crop. For canola, it's moisture, nitrogen, and then not too much heat. So there's certainly going to be challenges. However, gene editing, now that the government has provided clarity on that pathway to commercialization, is a real opportunity for Canada to take back some of those global R&D dollars to invest in crops that need less water, can deal with greater heat, and can be grown in different soil zones.
I would just maybe echo Mr. Kurek, who was hoping Liberals were listening when he was talking about taxes, that Conservatives are listening when we're talking about climate change. I think it's a really important point. Mr. Innes, do you have anything you want to add?
Just to say that when we look into the future for the soybean industry, it has to work for farmers. And so as the climate evolves, so too do the crops that make sense for farmers in the regions that we farm. We're growing soybeans in the most northern places that they grow anywhere on the planet. And we have many diverse growing regions. And so when we think about innovation that needs to respond to farmers' needs, it's creating the varieties that work in the specific regions where farmers grow and that are resilient to changes in weather and are ultimately profitable for farmers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Innes. Thank you for your time, Mr. Oliphant. We'll now go to Mr. Perron for 6 minutes or less.
Oui, merci beaucoup.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thanks to the witnesses for being with us today in person or online. It's always a pleasure to see you. I'll start with Dave, Mr. Carey, in fact. This particular committee studies the relationship with the People's Republic of China. In 2019, they blocked 2 Canadian companies from doing business with them. I'd like you to give us a rundown of what the impacts of that prohibition were, and given that the prohibition was lifted in 2022, how did the market recover? Did you take back the market shares that you previously had? was the quantity of canola sold to China, did it drop over that period, in fact?
And so restrictions on Canada's two largest exporters of canola seed began in March 6, 2019. In 2018, we exported $2.8 billion worth of canola. After the restrictions, we were exporting $800 million, so a $2 billion loss in exports over a one-year period. It is estimated that the economic impact to Canada was between $1.54 and $2.35 billion in 2021 as a result of that economic loss. But since market access has been reestablished for the two largest exporters, this year was actually our largest year ever of exporting canola seed. 2023 was exporting canola seed to China. As Brian said, China imports approximately 60% of the world's oil seed. So there's no getting away from their buying capacity, as well as their domestic crushing capacity. They have the ability to crush a lot of oil seed. So we have recovered. However, farmers certainly felt the acute economic impacts of losing our second largest market.
Monsieur Innes, ouais?
Et si je peux ajouter du côté du
Well, as far as soybeans is concerned, and certainly in the case of Quebec producers, we've observed that our soybean exports to China have slowed down. 2018 was a major exportation year for both Western and Eastern Canada. However, in 2020, for example, we didn't export much whatsoever, and there was no formal mechanism, as in the case of canola, and our industry was highly affected by problems in our relationship with China, as well as the relationship between China and the United States. So we live in a multipolar world, and the same applies to soybeans as other commodities. We were affected by the trade war between the US and Canada, and also Canada vis-a-vis China. Well, thank you very much for that information. On that point, I was going to turn to you. China intends to increase its production of soya to reduce its reliance on other countries. They set an objective of an increased production, which is quite significant. Is that concerning, that development? Well, in the soybean world, we're a producer of top quality soy, both in Quebec, Manitoba, and Ontario. We produce top caliber soya in terms of its food grade. Now, what that means is the soya that we produce to make tofu and soy milk. Now, the soy from China isn't of the same quality. So that does have an impact, for example, on non-GMO production, but not on high-quality food-grade soya. Now, we've observed in Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines, our export markets, that yes, China is now a competitor, but not a significant competitor in the region. Thank you very much. So you think that you're still nevertheless going to do quite well at the end of the day, I see. Now, I'll just open the question up. We are going to continue to do trade with China. I think we're unanimous around the table on that issue, but we have to be pragmatic in doing so. How do we reduce our reliance on China pragmatically? Our exports to Asia Pacific, to what degree are they reliant on China? Can we further diversify markets? Is that the underlying objective of the Indo-Pacific strategy? And what about the Philippines? Do you place a lot of hope in this Indo-Pacific strategy? Do you intend to continue to diversify or largely focus on the Chinese market? Well, if I could chime in first. China is very important, and as our exporters say, when China sells, we buy. But based on our experience of the recent past, diversification remains crucial for the sector, and that is precisely why the Indo-Pacific strategy is so important to us, as well as the Agri-Foods and Agriculture Office in the Philippines, so that we can work on the issues that I outlined a moment ago. For example, the removal of non-tariff trade barriers. That's part and parcel of our strategy, so that we can have new trade agreements, A, and B, a strategy to work on those non-tariff barriers, as I mentioned. Yes, Dave.
It's critical. It is important. However, for canola in the region, there's really no getting around China. Will continue to be a major market. Agriculture products always flow to the countries that demand them. We certainly have been working on diversification. The United Arab Emirates has become a major market for us, just under shy of $200 billion last year. But just to put it in context, $5 billion of canola exports to China in 2023. In a country like Vietnam, $604,000. So while there's certainly opportunity to, particularly with canola meal, which is the byproduct when you crush canola, you get oil and the meal certainly is something that we need to find new markets for. We've got more crush capacity in Canada, about 11 million metric tons now. We're adding about another 3 million tons. So there'll be new markets for meal, but China for the foreseeable future will be a hugely important market to Canada's canola farmers.
Thank you, Mr. Perron. That's your time. We'll now go to Ms. McPherson for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And this has been very interesting testimony. I want to thank the witnesses for being with us today. I have a few questions. I want to follow up on what Mr. Perron was speaking about. And the whole point of the Indo-Pacific strategy is, of course, to ensure that we are reducing our reliance on China. So I understand what you're saying when you say, Mr. Kerry, that we have a very big reliance on China, and then that's not going to change in the foreseeable future. On the other hand, we saw the punitive non-tariff trade barriers that were put in place by China on the soy industry, on the canola industry, and we were also know that it was politically motivated. So there is that vulnerability in terms of our relationship with China that we have to manage. How do we manage that vulnerability? How do we deal with that? But also, as we develop relationships with other countries in the Indo-Pacific region, how do we ensure that those relationships are not as vulnerable to punitive actions that we've seen with historically with our relationship with China? Maybe I'll start with you, Mr. Kerry, and then I can go to Mr. Harvey and Mr. Hines.
Yeah, we're large proponents of the Indo-Pacific Strategy and the Indo-Pacific Agriculture and Agri-Food Office. That part of the world is not transactional when they do business. They are built on long-term relationships. Western Europe, North America, even parts of Central America are transactional. When you get in the Indo-Pacific, these are about long-term relationships. So for us to do that, we've now established this office. We have a 5-year funding commitment from the federal government. 5 years is not long enough to build deep, meaningful relationships. So if we truly want to expand and diversify our markets, we need Canadian experts, we need Canadian industry, Canadian parliamentarians in market, not once a year, multiple times a year, to continue to build those relationships. As they are not transactional, they are deep and built on long-term relationships.
Mr. Harvey?
Sure. You'd say the way I see it is that, China is a market that's too large to replace exactly. And we're not the only ones dealing with this issue. If you look, our agri-food competitors, who are also our national security allies, like the United States and Australia, are dealing with similar issues. There's a political risk to manage, and it's not always easy to manage, and there's different ways to manage it, and one of the most important ways to manage it is to work on diversification of the markets, and that's where we've seen the Indo-Pacific office playing an important role.
And Mr. Hines?
Great, thank you. And just to elaborate on our experience in the soybean industry, having been exporting to Asia now for almost 4 or 5 decades, what we really see is the importance, to build on Dave's comments about relationships. As an example, our industry travels to the region together at least once a year. Our industry members themselves go more than that and have offices often. And where we were this year was in Thailand, and last year it was in Malaysia and Vietnam. And to tell you an example of how we can help this diversification, what we did while we were in Vietnam was meet with the local industry. We had a round table, something like this here today, with dozens of our customers, and we talked about the importance of stability of the relationship and how it was important working with our governments to work on trade issues together. And now with the office there, that enables more continuity so that the Government of Canada can be more present there more often. And so they're seen as a trusted partner, someone who is there working at multiple levels on the stable trade relationship. So for our industry, diversification means investing in relationships. It means supporting the investment of the Government of Canada in the Indo-Pacific office to help work through issues and build relations over time.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing to think about, because I think that there is a role for parliamentarians too to build those relationships and to ensure that we have that those connections and those relationships with people in the Indo-Pacific strategy as we try to diversify Canada's economy. But unfortunately, at this point, there is one party in the House of Commons that is not allowing for parliamentary travel at the moment, and it is disappointing because I think there is that role there. I feel, Mr. Kucharski, I feel like you're being a little bit abandoned, but we're both online, so I'm going to ask the next question of you, if I could. You spoke a lot about Canada being left out of the, as you call it, the mini-laterals, that we're not at those tables. We know that in the Indo-Pacific strategy that there is a desire by Canada to join in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity that the United States has launched in 2022. Can you explain why, first of all, why you think we're not being included? I think you touched on it, but just a little bit more detail. And also, do you think it is worthwhile? And what is the value of being part of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity?
Yeah, so if we want to talk about the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, although it's certainly not as valuable to Canada as, say, the CPTPP is, which is a full-blown trade agreement, it is important to be at the table where significant players in the region are sitting down talking to each other. And unfortunately, we are not at that table. So it's not just about trade, or it's not even just about investment. It's about relationship building in the region. And we have not been able to establish our bona fides, as it were, yet in the region because, quite frankly, we've had decades of neglect. We've underinvested in the region. We have not come to the table as we should with the commitment that is expected of us on defense and security. And so as a result, I believe that that has made some countries reticent about inviting Canada to the table, and they're not sure if we're a serious player. And so that was what I was touching on in my earlier comments. So I think, as we go forward and as we do follow through on the commitments we've made in the Indo-Pacific strategy, and hopefully strengthen the ones that, on our military security side as well, that will change. But I think that's the background.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson. That's your time. We'll now go to our second round, and that will be Mr. Majumdar, Ms. Lalonde, Mr. Perron, and Ms. McPherson again. So, Mr. Majumdar, 5 minutes for you, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Nice to see you, Jeff Kucharski. It's been a while. And I don't mean to be incestuous by bringing our Macdonald-Laurier roots together around this table, but I'll take advantage of the opportunity nevertheless. You've written extensively about the Indo-Pacific region. You've obviously looked at the Indo-Pacific strategy in careful detail. Let me ask you this. How is there a definition in the Indo-Pacific strategy of what the government terms as quote-unquote clean energy?
No, there isn't. It's a very general term, and it's defined, I guess, as they see it internally. So I couldn't tell you what clean energy is completely. Certainly there are things that most of us would consider as clean energy, non-emitting types of energy, but people will differ on a definition of clean energy.
I appreciate that. We've seen, Professor Kucharski, that Europe has had a chance to redefine how it considers clean energy in the wake of Russia's expanded invasion of Ukraine, particularly on things like LNG and nuclear. Would you agree, you've written extensively on Europe as well, but would you agree that that should be an international standard for, or at least the beginning of an international standard for defining what clean energy is?
Well, I do agree that if we're going to use a term like clean energy, it needs to be more specifically defined. And I think it should be more inclusive of even hydrocarbons where they are produced responsibly, where measures are taken to reduce emissions, because we're going to have to rely on all forms of energy in order to reach our emissions goals over time. So, yes, I would agree.
Well, thank you for that. You cautioned a little bit about what the impact of tension in the South China Sea could be, or even more widely in the waters of the Indo-Pacific region. Hong Kong Watch had recently published a report indicating that war with Taiwan would result in an 8% GDP hit to Canada, which is bigger than the COVID-19 pandemic, bigger than the global financial crisis. That would be 1% financial shocks, 5% semiconductor imports, 2% trade shocks. It strikes me that providing stability to the Indo-Pacific region, where you have energy suppliers like Russia leveraging their energy, or China's control and dominance of energy transition technologies, critical minerals refinery, all that stuff, Canada could play a critical role in offsetting dependence on dictator energy. How important do you think our energy proposition means to the Indo-Pacific region, and therefore ought to be read into the Indo-Pacific strategy?
Well, it's absolutely essential in my view, and I don't think the region. I think the region will be significantly held back if Canadian energy exports are in any way inhibited to the region. The fact remains that natural gas, in particular LNG, is going to be required in the region to reduce the amount of coal being burned, and therefore to reduce emissions. So. LNG as a substitute for coal is very important in their transition policies. A lot of these countries, particularly in ASEAN, are developing countries, and they are not able, or there are geographic reasons why renewables can't be installed immediately. So we're talking about transition that will take place over decades. And so that's going to require a wide range of energy sources. And Canada is in a position to provide responsible energy supplies to these countries as they transition going forward. And so it's a benefit to Canada, it's a benefit to them. They're asking us for these products, and we're just on the cusp of supplying for the first time. But I think more needs to be done.
Our national security, I guess, really serves international energy security. And I'm very grateful for your many interventions over many years in pushing Canada to think big about what it can be. Thank you very much. I'll close my time.
Thank you, Mr. Bajundar. And we'll go to Ms. Lalonde for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all our witnesses this evening. My first question would be for our representative from the Soy Canada industry. In early February of 2024, Soy Canada led a mission to the Indo-Pacific region, what they describe as connecting with more than 150 current and potential customers in Japan and in Thailand. Maybe you can share with our committee the key opportunity for Canadian soybean producers to the region, but also what was the main outcome of the Soy Canada mission to the Indo-Pacific region, please?
Thank you. Merci pour la question. When we look at the region, there's just an immense opportunity for growth. More than 2/3 of our exports of soybeans from Canada go to the region. They're a region that loves soybeans. They love to eat soybeans, and they're a region that needs protein and needs oil. So specifically, when we look at Japan, one of our most valuable markets, they really value the quality that Canada provides. The soybeans that we can export there are of the highest quality, with over 100 different specific varieties going to specific tofu manufacturers, for example. I can give you a story. When we were in Japan, we were visiting a tofu factory in the mountains and got to try their deep-fried tofu. It's not something we would find here, but certainly in Japan, when we take our farmers, we take our exporters, we connect with our customers in a way that's just not possible virtually. When we were in Thailand, we were able to visit a soy milk manufacturing facility, an ultra-modern facility that was a little bit different than tofu in the sense that they're looking for a more generic soybean. But what they value from Canada is the reliability of what we're able to produce, and also as a trusted partner to deliver when they expect it to be delivered. So when we look at the opportunities and what we take from that, in connecting our farmers. We had farmers from Quebec, Ontario, and Manitoba and Saskatchewan with us on the mission to see directly where their soybeans go and to see that container of soybeans opened at the soy milk manufacturer and dump into their facility was a real gratifying moment for our farmers to see not only how they plant and ship their soybeans, but also where they're used halfway, in fact, all the way around the world. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense of the value that we took from that. And certainly our customers appreciate touching the hand of the farmer that produces the soybeans that they use and appreciating that their need to produce food for their people has a connection back to a country like Canada that values that relationship.
Thank you very much. And maybe, I'm not sure if everyone could answer this, but certainly when you look at the disruptive actions on the international scenes by the PRCs, the geopolitical environment, and the reason of, certainly we're having conversation today, and we talked very briefly about the 2019 example. Maybe I could hear a little bit your thoughts on the Canada's economic relation with the main Indo-Pacific economies, and that means countries of ASEAN. And one of the strategy's priority sectors for developing Canada's ASEAN's relation in agriculture and agri-food. What do you think a free trade agreement between Canada and the ASEAN would benefit Canada's soybean industry? And maybe if others have a thought on this, I would certainly like to hear you. And why?
Yeah, I'm happy to start, but I know my colleagues would also like to contribute. So when we look at trade agreements, they establish relations between governments. They establish a real opportunity to make trade more stable. And we really want to see a useful agreement established between Canada and Indonesia and ASEAN.
I would just quickly say that we're very supportive of the Canada-ASEAN as well as the Canada-Indonesia Free Trade Agreement. We cannot take international trade for granted. For those of us that were at the WTO Ministerial Conference in the UAE this year, rules-based international trade is something that directly benefits every Canadian regardless of your sector, and it's not something we can take for granted. So the more multilaterals, bilaterals Canada signs, the more rules-based trade, the better the quality of living for all 40-odd million Canadians.
And I'd just add that these are quickly growing markets, and our competitors are there. Australia has an agreement with these countries.
Thank you.
very
And
much.
I know
That's your time, Ms.
Mr.
Lalonde.
Chair.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mr. Kusartsis.
Oh, well, all right. Yes, we'll give Mr. Kacharski a quick moment here. Go ahead, sir. Sorry.
Okay, I was just going to say very quickly, it's very gratifying to hear that the soybean and canola growers are looking to expand and diversify markets in ASEAN. I applaud that. The one thing I would say why that's particularly important is that before 2019, I just had a quick look at the statistics, but before the ban on canola, China represented 40% of Canada's total canola exports. And today, with $5 billion in exports, as was mentioned, Canada relies on the Chinese market for 65% of its total exports of canola. So as good as that business is, I just want to point out that's a huge vulnerability in a world where tensions with China are likely to continue, and there are very likely to be disagreements again between Canada and China at some point. You can bet that that number of canola exports will be used as a coercive mechanism by China again. It's a vulnerability we do have.
All right. Thank you for that. Now we'll go to Monsieur Perron for 2.5 minutes.
Oui, merci, monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I'd like to continue along the same lines. Perhaps Mr. Kerry first, if I may. Political insecurity in the region. We know what's happening in the East China Sea between China and the Philippines. A number of spats there. We saw what occurred only last week with Taiwan. What do you think about all of that? I know you have your office and you participated in negotiations, and that you'll be rolling things out in alternative markets, but there are tensions there, not just open tensions, but covert tensions, such as we saw with India over the past year, which certainly didn't help trade. I'd like your input on that.
Ce sont des risques.
Well, When it comes to selling goods, there are always risks to manage. There's business opportunities, there's growth opportunities, and we're going after those growth opportunities. But one always has to analyse the risk profile, including political risks and infrastructure risks, troubles at ports, labour relations issues, the possibility of strikes, climate-related risks, and we analyse those risks when we go into markets. There are different ways of managing risks, and one of the main ways of doing so is to diversify to the greatest extent possible. It's not the only way to go about it. When it comes to managing long-term relationships, as my counterpart said on a number of occasions, there's regulations in Canada and in other countries that have a bearing on managing the long-term relationships between trading nations. So this is part and parcel of the risks that we manage. Now, what about Canada's presence in India currently? Is that an expanding market at this stage of the game? Well, perhaps I'm not as abreast of that situation as my colleagues would be. Please proceed.
India is a very big soy market, but one that we are shut out of because they have really high tariffs against our products.
That would be the same. It gets very political in India, and they do grow their own version of canola called rapeseed, but tariffs are very high. Just wanted to say that we do work to establish relations with China. The chair of our farmer board, Roger Chevreau, was in Beijing in November. And just to Mr. Kucharski's point, we're less than actually 33% trade to China. If you're only looking at seed exports, then that is correct, but we're less than 33% trade exports to China. So we are working to diversify. They were $5 billion to $15.8 billion last year. Just wanted to get that on the record that our trade exposure to China is not actually increased.
Thank you, Mr. Perron. Actually, back when I was doing radio and television in Brandon, we called it rapeseed. I was the backup farm reporter, by the way, just so you know. All right, we'll go to Ms. McPherson for 2.5 minutes.
Pre-genetic version of rapeseed. Exactly. It's now called canola post-genetic modification.
Okay.
There are many people in the room that know much more about rapeseed and canola than I do. I can assure you, but thank you again for all of your information that you've been providing to us. Mr. Carey, you talked about China, and one of the things that keeps coming into my mind is, it's risky to be working in this market. I recognize that it's a giant market, and I recognize how important it is to us, but it is a risk because they have proven that they don't recognize the rule-based order when it comes to international trade, and that they are willing to politicize and weaponize that at any time. It's just something that I'm trying to get my head around when we talk about the Indo-Pacific strategy. I've been very concerned with the strategy that we're in fact taking eggs from one basket and putting them in another with regards to human rights. We speak about India and the challenges that we have there, that we're not in fact thinking that this strategically enough, I guess, is one of my concerns. Now, I know in February, the government did open the Indo-Pacific Agriculture and Agri-Food Office. And I'm just wondering if all of you have some comments to make on whether you've seen any impact of that to date, and whether or not you believe that there is sufficient, that is resourced sufficiently, it has what it needs to do, the job that it needs to do. Why don't we go backwards? Mr. Irons, why don't I start with you?
Happy to start. And when we were in Thailand, actually, we had the new director of the office present to our seminar and meet our customers and meet our exporters and farmers firsthand. So we're seeing that office, just recently set up this spring, is already having an impact by connecting regulators to regulators in different markets, such as Indonesia, such as Bangladesh, such as Thailand as well. And what we're seeing in that office is a real presence in the region. Just like I described that our sector is looking to be present in that region multiple times per year, so too is it helpful for the Government of Canada to be there more often in as many places as one can be. So the investment in the office shows that Canada's invested in the region, and what we've seen through our seminar this spring is having someone on the ground to speak to people, to make networks and expand networks, and having the Government of Canada present beyond what it has done in the past is really helpful.
I would say echo my colleagues' comments. I guess our only, and it's not a criticism, our only advice would be we need a 5-year commitment. 5 years, we need to be looking longer term than simply 5 years. Right now it's a staff of about 10 with a $35 million envelope over a 5-year period. If we want to be serious about it, we need to look at that as that's just the beginning. This office can't go away after 5 years. And just lastly, that even in that part of the world, diplomatic postings are typically 3 years. As I spoke earlier about the deep relationship in that part of the world to do business, we should also consider potentially having longer diplomatic postings to establish those regulator to regulator relationships.
And I'd just add, in any market, you've got questions of political risk, of regulatory risk. The office, I think, is going to play a key role in managing regulatory risk, in particular, with the regulatory authorities in those countries. But it's also useful in terms of political risk because it helps show a commitment to our relations with those countries in the agri-food sector.
Thank you very much.
Now, any comments?
Well, I think those are all good. The risk management measures that were pointed out. The only thing I would say is that, you know, irrespective of the good relationships and relationship building we try to do and having offices in the region and so on, you know, a country that essentially, you know, it's an authoritarian regime where political goals are going to trump trade and relationships, depending on the issue. So, I mean, you know, it's good to have relationships, and I totally agree that it's a relationship-driven region. But at the end of the day, China will make decisions that are in its own political interest. And if that means we're a casualty, well, then so be it.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll now go to our next round. We have Mr. Chong and then Mr. Fragascatos. We did get a little bit of a late start, so we'll maybe do another round after that, Ms. Lantzman and Mr. Erskine-Smith, and then round it out with Mr. Perron and Ms. McPherson. So that'll polish off our first panel, if that's okay with you guys. So let's go. Mr. Chong for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing. You know, when I first arrived here in 2004, a lot of free trade agricultural associations were telling us that we needed to diversify trade away from the United States because we were overly reliant on that single trading partner. And so subsequently, governments negotiated the Common Economic Trade Agreement with the European Union and the CPTPP in the Indo-Pacific region. When you look at global GDP, we've got a free trade agreement with the United States, which is about a quarter of global GDP. We've got one with Europe, which is just under 20%, and now we have one with the Indo-Pacific region, which is roughly another 15 or so percent. So we add it all up, we have free trade agreements now with over 50% of the global economy. And yet, it doesn't seem like we're taking advantage of those newly negotiated and implemented agreements. You know, I pulled up some trade data. In 2022, the most recent year for which I have data, Canada's primary and secondary agricultural production amounted to $94 billion Canadian. Some of that going to the Indo-Pacific region. The Netherlands exported 167 billion Canadian dollars on current exchange rates. That's almost double what we exported. So why are grains and oilseeds associations not? What's the solution to this? Right? What's the solution? Because, you know, the Dutch export more fats and oils than we do, and as you know, they're on a postage stamp of a country. How come they export way more fats and oils than we do?
If I could start, thank you for the question. I guess I would first share that we are taking advantage of opportunities created by trade agreements. I was just in Korea as part of the Team Canada Trade Mission, and we have 17,000 tons out of a 300,000 ton market that we fill routinely every year. that is tariff-free, that is opportunity for us to add value and have the highest value soybeans go to those customers who appreciate our quality. And we would love to have more of that 300,000 ton market than the 17 that we have now through the trade agreement. So I would say that there are opportunities and we are taking advantage of them. But to your question, how do we get more? I think that's a really important question that our industry is continually speaking to our government partners about federally and provincially. And for us, it's about recognizing our competitive and comparative advantage and looking at the infrastructure required to help us excel. So there was a question earlier about transportation infrastructure. That is a key piece of it. Innovation infrastructure and research infrastructure that allows the industry to capture the most value from the highest value markets, to your point around how the Netherlands succeeds. We see those as key opportunities. So for us, for example, we're working on the next generation of a soy quality program. How do we sell the highest quality soy in the world without having a soy quality program here in Canada is a key question we're struggling with that we need to work together in our country on.
I would just say it's a very good question. And besides what my colleague said, we need massive investments in our trade corridors, our infrastructure, our ports, the demurrage costs. But
so as a colleague of mine mentioned, the Port of Vancouver ranked 347th out of 348 ports for global efficiency, second last out of 348. So what do we need to do to get the Port of Vancouver more efficient so that we can export more of your members' products to the Indo-Pacific region? Because that is our country's largest port.
Yeah, if you look at it from a resilience perspective, I said earlier, we have one bridge and we have one tunnel that goes in the Port of Vancouver. That's all owned by CN. So we have no resilience. There's no backup plan for that. Marine vessel traffic still takes precedence over getting rails action in the Port of Vancouver. We need railways to deliver on time. They need to be predictable. But to your broader point around why the Netherlands are so successful is, I would suggest that not only signing a free trade agreement is just the start. Implementing and following through on trade agreements are critical. The USTR, U.S. Trade Representative, have an entire office dedicated to the enforcement of their free trade agreements. We have not seen the CETA agreement provide really the opportunities for agriculture because the EU is not following through in the spirit of that. So I think a big part of it is looking at signing a trade agreement is relatively easy. It's very difficult, relatively easy. Implementing and enforcing the spirit of free trade agreements is something Canada needs to make a priority.
Thank you, Mr. Chong. We'll now go to Mr. Franciscatos for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. Mr. Kerry, earlier tonight you talked about the transactional nature of trade relationships that we find generally in Western countries, as opposed to Asia writ large, where something else is at play, where the importance of long-term relationships, I think you put it in that way, that's much more important in terms of serving as a driving force to ensure the long-term viability of trade relations. I wonder if you could expand a bit on that and what ultimately underpins those long-term relationships, how they're brought into being and how they're maintained.
Yeah, government and industry both have a role to play. The example that I use, and my colleague Brian or Michael might have some great examples too, is that for the last, I think we're going on year 48, we call the pre-consultations, where we host the Japanese every year, then they host us every year. They want the same farmers going every year. They want to see the same government officials. We all recognize politics and democracies, but they want to know that when they have a relationship with Canada, whether it's importer, they know the people in Canada. They've come to Canada. They want to come visit our farms. They want to visit the facilities. Markets like that, like the Japanese market, I believe with soy as well, when that's established, that's relationship going on 50 years of economic activity, nearly $1 billion of exports to Japan last year. But that has been the result of 40 plus years of industry government collaboration and dialogue. Oftentimes when you're doing business in parts of the world like Southeast Asia, the first meeting is not when you're closing the deal, where in the United States and Western Europe, that often is. It's transactional and you move on. They're looking to forge long-term relationships. They're looking in decades, not looking in, the next quarter, for example, and that requires sustained effort. Trade agreements, that requires trade missions, that requires offices, that requires hosting and reciprocating, and they really want us to come to Canada and see the farms that grow the products that they're purchasing. So there's no silver bullet, but it's sustained, long-term, genuine relationship building in that part of the world.
Point taken, and I think it's a point that might be lost on many, because you think trade, you think dollars and cents, the transactional sort of traditional approach, but it's not so straightforward. Any thoughts from Mr. Innes or Mr. Harvey on that point?
Just to build on my colleague's comments, when our sector looks at investment, the soybeans that are used in tofu today in Japan started more than 10 years ago here in Canada. It takes a long time to develop a specific variety of soybeans that will provide value to our customers. And it's not just providing value to our customers, but value to our farmers. So when we look at value-added food-grade soybeans, for example, it's giving our farmers 30% more per acre relative to the conventional or commodity alternative. And that long-term relationship value with the customer who tells the industry 10 years ahead what they're going to need in 10 years, and the industry invests and then delivers on it, speaks to the importance of long-term thinking.
I'd just bring it back to what Mr. Carey was saying about our infrastructure. Reliability is a key element of the relationship because the buyers need to know that the product's going to arrive. And if you can't meet a timeline, then that's going to hurt your credibility, right?
No, of course. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that I was recently at the Ferguson family bean farm just outside of London in St. Thomas. And when you made your point about how long it takes to develop a bean crop there, Mr. Ennis, matches with what exactly they told me. Now, I grew up in a rural area as well, so I don't come to it absent any knowledge, but always good to learn about these things. So what you're telling us basically is this requires a lot of hard work that, again, isn't noticed at first glance. What needs to go into all of this? Is it well, actually, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Mr. Carey. What do we need to prepare for as part of a wider Indo-Pacific strategy on the agriculture side to ensure these long-term relationships come into being and are sustained?
Yeah, I mean, as my colleague Mr. Innes said, knowing your markets, knowing what they want and why they're coming to Canada. Canada, we don't often have a price advantage. We have a high quality. We have certainly have a reputation of food safety, of excellence in food products, but Canada is not the cheapest country to produce agriculture. We have a high standard of living. We've got high costs. So knowing what your markets want, and then as my colleague Mr. Harvey said, increasingly the questions that our colleagues around the CAFTA table get asked is by importers is, you've got the product, you've got the quality, will it be here on time? And that comes down to infrastructure, whether it's rail, ports, vessels. But knowing what your markets want and then delivering, but not delivering on time is becoming an increasing problem for Canada's global reputation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Prakaskatos. So we'll switch up a little bit. We'll go to Mr. Courik now for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and it's been a great series of rounds. Now specifically, Mr. Carey, I know we've talked a little bit about the non-tariff trade barriers that had been put forward on Chinese imports of our canola products. I'm just curious if you can give me just very quickly a snapshot of where things are at in terms of addressing those things.
Yeah, the concerns that the Chinese officials cited were around weed seeds and other pathogens like blackleg, and those are issues that were adjudicated at a technical level. Canada did bring forth a WTO case, but as of right now, we have full market access restored with China, and again, not something we take for granted. We don't take any market for granted, but as of right now, all shippers have access to the Chinese market. However, they have to go through the requisite approvals, and canola seed is typically what they want. They like to crush it themselves.
Yeah. So I appreciate that. You had made a statement that said free trade agreements are the start, and I know I'll be asking our friends from the Canadian Cattle Association some fairly direct questions about this in the next round. But what can the government of Canada do to make sure that we are able to empower industry to actually access the markets that we've signed free trade agreements for, to make sure that our products are in fact getting to markets? And I'll preface that just with a quick anecdote. I speak often with counterparts and ambassadors from other countries, and quite often they highlight how when they speak with the federal government, there's a massive disconnect between what provinces produce. And that's true on agriculture, as it is true on a whole host of other things that are an intricacy of our federation, which many states around the world don't have that same understanding of. So what do we do to make sure that the high quality products that your members, many of which are my constituents, produce, how do we make sure that that can actually get to market and that people know what they're buying, can trust what we're selling, and ultimately provide that reciprocal relationship that is supposed to be what trade is built on?
It certainly comes down to federal provincial collaboration. Many of the provinces have trade offices around the world. I think it's knowing what any particular market wants and what those issues are. Some of them are political, some of them are technical. Developing countries often look to countries like Canada. Help us walk through why your country is not a concern for this pest, this pathogen. But it takes long-term concerted effort, and for those for which we have an FTA, Canada must make sure that our counterparts follow through on the spirit of the agreement. If it says may and they're interpreting shall, you have to hold them accountable for may.
I appreciate that. So Mr. Hines, Mr. Harvey, is there anything you want to add there in 30 seconds or so?
Yeah, just to build on that, when we think about how the Government of Canada engages with our counterparts, the benefit of the Indo-Pacific Office is that there is someone who deeply understands the region that is then able to help coordinate the federal government and the provincial assets and resources alongside industry and the group that Michael co-chairs, Mr. Harvey co-chairs, to be able to make those assets be useful and really provide more trade stability over time.
Okay. Mr. Harvey, is there anything you want to add very quickly?
That's good.
Okay. Thank you. And now our friend from the Macdonald Laurier Institute, we've talked a lot about energy security, and Mr. Oliphant made a suggestion that it'd be nice if we talk more about climate change. And I would suggest that the best way that we can address some of the challenges of climate change is get Canadian energy around the world. And that not only deals with climate policy, it deals with security policy, it deals with energy policy, and all of those things make the world a better place. So I'm curious, though, when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, we need to get our resources to market. What can we do to ensure that we can do so quickly? Because right now we see, and over the last especially 2 years, we have seen how energy security tied with the security of nations and closely connected to food security as well. But I want, if you could focus on energy security, how do we actually get our resources to market, whether that's the Indo-Pacific or across the entire planet? In about 30 seconds or so, if you could.
Well, I think infrastructure is absolutely key. So we've just, for the first time in Canada's history, essentially we now have the infrastructure to ship crude oil to Asia. And the first shipment left, like I said, last Wednesday. And hopefully next year, the first major LNG export facility will come online, LNG Canada, and that will start to export to the region. And all of a sudden, Canada's energy exports to that region are going to increase substantially. And so infrastructure is key. We could use more capacity. Clearly, production is there. The resource is there. But the only bottleneck is right now is infrastructure, because moving product to Asia is not difficult, and there's certainly a market and demand there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Courig. We'll now go to Mr. Erskine Smith for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much. I want to start with Soy Canada. All of you in various ways have mentioned the importance of population growth to driving demand. In order to sustainably manage that growth, how important are alternative proteins?
Well, thanks for the question. I mean, what we're seeing is, whether it's in North America or Europe or in Asia, where soy is very much part of the local palate, is that there is a growing demand for plant-based protein. To your specific question, I'm not necessarily the one equipped to be able to articulate an answer that really gets at the premise of your question. But what I would say is that we're seeing demand grow for plant-based protein and demand for soy based on the premise of your question.
Well, one of the reasons I asked the question is because I've got a bill in Parliament. We'll be debating it Friday and voting on it next week around pandemic prevention and preparedness. And if you read any of the evidence around pandemic prevention and reducing pandemic risk, we have to address some of the unsustainable practices and the spillover risks around animal proteins and the increased demand for animal proteins. Obviously, your product helps to address that, at least in part. And yet, in the course of that debate on the bill recently, a Conservative member suggested, and I'm going to quote, alternative protein is just a far left dog whistle that means crickets. That's a sitting member of parliament. That's not a far right conspiracy theorist. So what would you say to someone who says that alternative protein is just a far left dog whistle that means crickets? Your product isn't a far left dog whistle that means crickets, I don't think.
Well, thanks for the question. Our product is grown by approximately 30,000 farmers across Canada. And I always say that there's no such thing as a soybean farmer, in the sense that we have an industry that's integrated with grains, often integrated with livestock as well, that can take advantage of crops that are an important part of the rotation or work in certain regions of Canada to help farmers manage risk and profitability. So we're very much part of a system. So the product itself is a plant protein, and it's growing and the demand is strong for it. But in terms of the whole industry, it is very much part of an ecosystem.
Thanks very much. I want to ask, so there have been some comments from my colleague, and I respect a great deal, Mr. Couric. The CPTPP, how important is that for the expansion of trade in the Indo-Pacific and Canadian trade?
That's a key agreement. You've got some of the most important countries in the region and major markets like Japan and South Korea. CPTPP is also an area where we've got a competitive advantage over the U.S. because they're not members. So it's
exactly.
So it's a key agreement.
I agree. The second piece I want to ask, the Indo-Pacific Office, how important is that to expanding Canadian trade in the region?
So the Indo-Pacific Office, we've asked for it to concentrate very much on the expanding markets, the growing markets, like in Indonesia, like in Malaysia, like the Philippines, and we wanted to concentrate on the regulatory issues that often become non-tariff barriers. So we were mentioning just a few minutes ago the difficulties of the EU, where maybe the tariff barriers aren't there, but we're getting blocked out by non-tariff barriers. What we want is regulatory officials who can work with regulatory officials to work things out at a regulatory level, either because the issue is lack of knowledge, uncertainty, or sometimes to expose that the issue is really political. The best way to do it is to work through the regulatory issue.
But my point is a government that does care about economic growth, that does care about supporting Canadian industry, a government like that would probably enter into an agreement like the CPTPP or open an Indo-Pacific office, right?
If I could answer your question on the Indo-Pacific office, it is a very important tool that helps us take the next step in having more stable and diversified trade in the Indo-Pacific. And governments of many stripes, provincially and federally in Canada, if we see things through the eye of our customer, and we see things through the eye of the people who need food for themselves and to feed their animals, they value that stability and relationship by having an agreement with Canada through the CPTPP and by having the investment of Canada in the Indo-Pacific Agri-Food Office.
Thanks very much. And Mr. Kaczarski, similarly, you mentioned the importance of infrastructure. And over the last 9 years, I don't necessarily think the $35 billion towards that pipeline that is going to be the first you said the first time in Canadian history that crude oil is going to be opportunity for crude oil to be shipped across the Pacific. And we've got a commitment, $35 billion to that pipeline to get it done. You've got the first time LNG Canada is going to be able to be exported in a serious way. I mean, again, I'm not suggesting everything's been perfect, but surely you would say this government has, in some cases, tried to move mountains to get product shipped.
Well, I would say, the TMX expansion took, 10 years? It really shouldn't take that long. If we're serious players in the world, we need to learn how to do these regulatory reviews and approvals quicker. We need to, do the permitting quicker. We need to do the decision-making quicker. Yes, it's absolutely important to the oil industry. It's absolutely important to the gas industry. I think we could do more. I think we can do a lot more. And we're talking about this in the critical mineral space where the government is trying to speed up the approvals process. But yet we still seem to have a problem with oil and gas.
Thank you, Mr. Erskine-Smith. We'll now go to Mr. Perron for 2.5 minutes.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I'll just try and squeeze this in 2.5 minutes. Would you have any concrete proposals to make that we could include in our report to the government? Well, maintaining long-term relationships over 3 years, ambassadors, you said, and also the office that should be maintained. And ideally, and what I see as a subtext to what you're saying is long-term staffing of that office. That's the only way. But it's difficult when it's Asia Pacific. Now, you talked about a regular and stable supply chain to give you predictability, foreseeability, in the markets where you deliver those goods. I talked about the office and keeping it maintained. Dave, you talked about more processing, and that kind of resonated with me. Perhaps there should be more value added by further processing domestically. If you could chime in on that.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there and a lot of very good questions. On the value-added processing side, Canada is exceptionally blessed with our natural resources, whether they're agriculture, forestry, oil and gas. However, what we've done historically is pull things out of the ground, whether they're agriculture or oil and gas or forestry, export it as a raw product, then import it value-added. So if we get more into the business of value adding, doing it here, those create high paying jobs. And when we do export it, we're getting that premium. So absolutely we would support across all the industries. And my colleague, Mr. Ennis, spoke to what the soy industry is doing. And we've seen billions of dollars in the canola crush plants. We definitely need more investment infrastructure. We have a competition issue in Canada. We have 2 Class 1 railways that we're going to be in strike position, now been referred to the Industry Relations Board. But we need to invest in our ports. We need to invest in our infrastructure. Canada needs to be a country that can attract global investment in research and development. So no silver bullet here, but a lot of the issues that we face as a country that are barriers are of our own doing. Geopolitics is one thing, but there's a lot we can do here domestically to be more competitive, more profitable.
Monsieur Harvey, Monsieur Ennis, sur ça?
The other gentleman? Well, the discussions with Indonesia and ASEAN, they're important agreements. Well, when it comes to the agricultural sector, we want more value added through processing, but there's also an opportunity to diversify our crops and how we develop our crops, such as soya. Food-grade soya that is used in Japan is about 30% more per acre vis-a-vis the alternative soybean product. So there's an opportunity to invest in top quality commodities to give back more to the processors and producers so that we can package these products to meet the special needs of our clients.
To Ms. McPherson for our final 2.5 minutes.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. You know, I'm taking away a lot from your conversation. The idea that we need to invest in our infrastructure, the long-term relationships that we need to build, the idea of how we deal with the sector as a whole, I think is very important for us. I'd like to give everybody one last chance to tell us, I guess, what are the recommendations you need to see in this report? I mean, this is ultimately why you're here. Is there anything that we haven't asked you that you want to make sure gets on the record, gets into this report? Mr. Harvey, why don't I start with you, because you didn't get a chance in the last question.
We just went through the recommendations. I'm looking for something else. I think one thing that we know is a very difficult political circle to square are the conversations with India, where there have been a lot of barriers over the years, and the political relationship is very difficult. But we can't ignore the fact that it's a major market, and that we'll want to get back to those conversations when we can.
Yeah, certainly there's human rights challenges that we have there. Mr. Carey?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess I would answer with a comment that the Canadian agriculture and agri-food is larger than Canadian auto and aerospace combined economically. However, we do not see agriculture and agri-food get the attention, the spotlight, the investment, or the time and attention of government nearly the way that we see now with critical minerals and electric vehicles. So invest in the agriculture and agri-food sector, and it will pay dividends for taxpayers and global peace and security.
And specifically with the Indo-Pacific strategy, when we look at that strategy as a tool to help us orient our thinking on commerce, completing agreements with ASEAN and Indonesia help establish new frameworks that create more stability. That is an important priority for something that the Government of Canada has control over. Secondly, I would add that when we look at the investment in the Indo-Pacific Office, that is a commitment to stability and investment and presence over time. That's the sort of thing that the Government of Canada needs to keep doing to help business do our jobs and farmers to do our jobs to produce efficiently, competitively, and deliver for our customers.
Thank you. Mr. Kucharski.
I'll divide it into two, economics and security. And we've talked about infrastructure, critical that we remove the bottlenecks and get things done in a reasonable amount of time. That also means regulatory reform. And we have to address taxes because we compete with other regimes on our tax regime. On the security side, we need to step up our investments in the military. We need to protect our intellectual property from cybercrime. And we need to get more participation by the Canadian government and others in the regional fora in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And to our panelists, thank you. It's been very enlightening. You know, that one rail bridge over the Second Narrows that goes up and down to let the tanker from the terminal go through on its way to China is something that, does impact the efficiency of the Port of Vancouver. That said, come the day that we're not shipping all of that coal out of Roberts Bank, perhaps there's going to be some capacity there to do something more productive for the world. But that's something we can think about in the future. We need to, you want a pipeline? Come today. We will suspend while we change our panels, but again, thank you very much for your attendance tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you to our second panel for being here from the Canadian Cattle Association. And probably the focus of some very serious hat envy tonight. Tyler Fulton, the Vice President, and Jennifer Babcock joining him, Senior Director, Government Relations and Public Affairs. From Energy for a Secure Future, we'll have Shannon Joseph online. Good to have you with us tonight. And no stranger, at least to some of us here, Paul Landsbergen, who is a frequent flyer at our Fisheries Committee, who's here to talk about fish. Imagine that. So we'll start with you, Mr. Fulton. You have 5 minutes for an opening comment.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee to discuss the Canadian beef sector's experience with the People's Republic of China. I'm Tyler Fulton. I'm a beef producer from Birtle, Manitoba, and I currently serve as the Foreign Trade Chair and Vice President of the Canadian Cattle Association. I can sum up our views on China succinctly by stating that we are dissatisfied with the present situation in which we have no access for Canadian beef exports. It's also questionable whether any future access for Canadian beef exports to China will come with the security that trade rules should provide. China suspended imports from one Canadian beef exporting facility in 2020, citing COVID concerns. It is important to note that they did not take similar action against beef facilities in other countries that were experiencing COVID outbreaks amongst their employees. China expanded its action against Canadian beef by suspending all imports in December 2021, following the discovery of an atypical case of BSE in a Canadian cow. To be clear, the discovery of an atypical BSE should not be cause for trade restrictions. To quote the World Organization for Animal Health, atypical BSE refers to naturally and sporadically occurring forms which are believed to occur in all bovine populations at a very low rate, and which have only been identified in older bovines when conducting intensive surveillance. In other words, every country that is undertaking proper surveillance should expect to detect an atypical BSE case. While a few countries briefly suspended imports, China is the only trading partner not to quickly restore Canadian beef access. It is further galling to us that China has singled out Canadian beef for such trade restrictions. The USA has discovered a number of atypical cases, including a case in May of last year, yet China has not suspended U.S. exports. I want to be clear that China did act appropriately toward the U.S. Atypical BSE cases. Atypical BSE cases do not warrant trade restrictions. China should have treated Canada in the same manner they treated the U.S. Brazil reported 2 atypical BSE cases in 2021 and was suspended by China for 13 days. It's inappropriate that China took trade action against Brazil, but at least they moved quickly to restore trade, proving that they can do what they want to. It's been over 29 months since China suspended Canadian beef, with no apparent interest in restoring trade. Our analysis is that China has violated at least 2 fundamental provisions of the WTO agreements. Firstly, they have violated the sanitary and phytosanitary provisions by imposing a trade restricting measure in contravention with the relevant international standard without any risk assessment or scientific justification. Second is the discrimination they have shown by treating Canada more restrictively than they have other trading partners. We had hoped that China might lift these sanctions through constructive dialogue, but our frustration has grown these last 2+ years as China has refused to engage with Canadian officials. Despite some recent meetings, no results have been achieved, nor seem likely in the near future. Given this experience, we have serious concerns that even if or when China resumes imports of Canadian beef, we will not be able to rely on the access being secure for the long term. With the lack of action and movement on China's part, our sector has started to raise the concern if Canada should start a formal process to exercise our WTO rights. We need to send a strong signal to China and all of our trading partners that Canada will always stand up for science and rules-based trade. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fulton. We'll now go to Mr. Landsbergen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the invitation to testify today. Before I get to my specific comments, I would like to spend a few minutes to give some additional context of the Council, our sector, and our trade. The Fisheries Council of Canada is the national voice for our wild capture fisheries across Canada. Our member companies are processors who process the majority of Canada's fish and seafood, and our members include small, medium, and larger sized companies along with Indigenous enterprises who collectively harvest in Canada's 3 oceans. The Canadian seafood industry employs 72,000 in direct jobs, mainly in coastal and rural communities. In essence, the sector is the beating economic heart of these communities. The sector accounts for $7.6 billion in exports to over 100 countries, and the largest export markets are the United States at 64%, China at 19%, Hong Kong and Japan both at 2.5%, and the UK at 1.6%. Growing global demand for protein, including fish and seafood, points to growth opportunities for our sector. FCC and the Canadian Aquaculture Industry Alliance, our counterpart on the farming side of the industry, have developed a joint 20-year vision to be a global top 3 best quality and sustainable fish and seafood producer. Not the largest, but the best. With this vision, we have 3 aspirational goals. We want to double the value of the Canadian industry, double economic benefits to largely coastal communities, and double domestic consumption of fish and seafood. And these are definitely ambitious goals, but if you don't aim high, you don't achieve high. The last and most important backdrop for our conversation today is our sustainability performance. Canada is a global leader in sustainable fisheries management with a robust regulatory regime, and DFO reports that 95% of our fish stocks are harvested at sustainable levels. In addition, Canada's adoption of independent third-party certification for sustainable practices is in the top 5 in terms of percentage of landings certified. So we should feel proud of our collective stewardship of our fish resources. So all of this is important context for my remarks today, and now I'd like to move on to the specifics of the Indo-Pacific strategy. Last year, we exported $1.9 billion to 15 countries in the region. China is by far the largest destination, receiving $1.4 billion, representing 77% of our exports to the region. Japan received $188 million, representing about 10%. South Korea, $94 million, or 5%, and then Vietnam and Taiwan rounded out the top 5. Our imports total $1.6 billion from 20 countries in the region, leaving us with a trade surplus of about $300 million. The top countries for our imports are China, $517 million, or 32%, Vietnam, $307 million, or 19%, India, $274 million, or 17%, Thailand, $256 million, or 16%, and Indonesia at $91 million, or 6%. Our exports over the last 10 years have grown 78% in the region, while imports have grown more slowly at only 14%. Our top export markets, of our top export markets, we are net exporters to China, Japan, and South Korea. We are a net importer from Vietnam, and we're essentially balanced in Taiwan. While we agree with the strategy of diversifying in the region, it is difficult to do. There's ever-growing demand for fish and seafood in China, and it is critically important to our sector. For some species, China is our primary or even our only market. Having said that, we see growth potential in the region as it has a large population and a strong seafood culture. FCC partnered with Canada Brand in Vietnam to have our seafood consumer guide translated into Vietnamese and promoted in country. We partnered with the consulates in Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi, and this was the first time FCC had done something like this, and it was a good experiment. Another thing that's important is I'm a member of Agriculture Canada's Indo-Pacific Industry Working Group. We provide input in how the department actions its role in the Indo-Pacific region as part of the strategy. And our initial discussions revolved around the location and the operationalization of its new office in Manila. And I'm happy to be the lone seafood representative in that group. We are also pleased to see that EDC is expanding in the region. It has new offices in Jakarta and Seoul and added staff in Singapore. And this year it is opening new representations in Ho Chi Minh City, Tokyo, and Manila. And with that, I feel free to ask me any questions regarding the free trade negotiations in the region, trade missions, and opportunities for specific species. And I welcome questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Landsbergen. We'll now go to Shannon Joseph, who's Chair of Energy for a Secure Future. Ms. Joseph, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Energy for a Secure Future, or ESF, is an initiative focused on building a new conversation about the future of energy in Canada and our potential global role in supporting our international allies with energy security and sustainable development. Our national network includes unions, Indigenous leaders, farmers, mayors, industry leaders, and others who share a vision for this role for Canada. I would like to propose 3 themes for the committee to consider as foundational to Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy. The first is energy security, which is a top priority for our allies. The second, environmental performance and the role of Canadian LNG. And the third is economic growth for our own country. Since our founding in early 2023, ESF has produced 2 discussion papers related to our potential global energy role. One focused on how Indigenous ownership in the energy space has evolved and is playing a role in a secure energy future. The other on the value proposition of Canadian LNG export opportunities. Following from the launch of these papers, ESF has engaged with members of the diplomatic community in Canada. This includes ambassadors or consuls general of our G7 allies, as well as key G20 partners, including India and South Korea. What we've heard is that many of our Indo-Pacific allies continue to rely on energy from Russia despite their desire for alternatives, and all see the potential reliable supply of Canadian liquefied natural gas as beneficial to their long-term objectives around energy security and democratic cooperation. Here are some figures to consider. 2/3 of South Korea's electricity generation is provided by fossil fuels, of which 98% are imported. Coal represents 40% of that electricity generation, of which 81% is imported from Russia. India is the 3rd largest energy consumer in the world and gets roughly 3/4 of its primary energy from coal, petroleum, and natural gas. In the past 2 years, India has increased its imports of price-discounted Russian energy. What we have heard from them is that buying LNG from Canada is desirable and would be a lower-cost alternative to many, including the United States. This committee has already heard from Japan's ambassador on this subject. They too see important value in Canadian LNG for meeting their energy needs. Today, Canada is not a global security player, and we are excluded from many major initiatives, including AUKUS and the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. And if Canada truly seeks to be a strategic ally in the Indo-Pacific, energy is one of our most potent cards, and it is vital that we listen to our friends in the region when they describe their needs and priorities. On environmental performance, Canada's climate change objectives, specifically our Paris target, is often used as the reason why our natural gas production should not grow or our domestic manufacturers must bear higher energy or carbon costs. And while responsive to the Paris Agreement, this target does not move the needle on global emissions, which is the meaningful goal. Papers from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the National Bank of Canada, and others have highlighted the important environmental role of increased LNG exports from Canada. The Chamber's paper highlights that by displacing 20% of Asia's coal-fired electricity with Canadian LNG, it would reduce global emissions by more than Canada's total GHG emissions in 2021 annually. Analysis from the National Bank of Canada shows that if Canadian LNG were an alternative to India's current plans to double coal production by 2030, the equivalent of 3.5 times Canada's total 2021 GHG emissions would be reduced annually. And this brings me to the third theme, which is domestic economic growth. An effective Indo-Pacific strategy means more high-income jobs for Canadian workers. Earlier this year, I, alongside our partners in the Canada's building trades, met with Federal Labour Minister to convey the importance of LNG jobs to Canadian workers. These are some of the biggest job contracts in the country, and these jobs underpin social mobility in Canada. Indigenous nations are owners and partners in the export facilities, pipelines, and upstream gas production of Canadian LNG. The Cedar LNG project will be the first majority First Nations-owned LNG project in Canada's history. Canada's role as an LNG player will meaningfully create prosperity and advance reconciliation for these nations. And finally, if we want to address the productivity and investment gap in Canada, then we need to be a place that gets things done. And showing focus and commitment in our approach to the Indo-Pacific and delivering for our allies can be an important part of this demonstration. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Joseph. We're going to go to our rounds of questioning. Ms. Joseph, I get you to move your microphone up just a little bit. There's some pee popping there that gets a little hard on our interpreters, okay? You should tune in the dialogue after to hear what you sound like in French, all right? Okay, we have for our first round Mr. Chong, then Mr. Fragascatos, Mr. Perron, and Ms. McPherson. So Mr. Chong?
Mr. Chair, I think, yeah, Mr. Perkins is going to go first.
Oh, we had Mr. Perkins going second, but if Mr. Perkins wants the extra minute, then
Okay,
Mr. Perkins can go first.
either way. I'm happy to go first. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right.
Thank you for witnesses for their opening remarks. I wanted to ask Madam Joseph some questions. She talked about coal-fired electricity plants and India. We know that the world is burning more coal than ever, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. China burns more coal than all the rest of the world combined. The International Energy Agency said about a decade ago that coal burning for electricity production had peaked. I think they obviously were way too early because we saw record high 2 years ago, record high last year, and on the data I've seen, it looks like 2024 will smash through all records in terms of coal consumption for the production of electricity. We also know that a kilowatt hour of electricity produced from gas, natural gas, has half the GHG emissions of a kilowatt hour produced from coal. And so maybe you could tell us a little bit about your organization's view as to the importance of exporting LNG from Canada's west and east coasts so that we can displace more coal-fired electricity generation, which accounts for more than a fifth of all the world's GHG emissions.
Thank you very much. So yes, since in particular the invasion of Ukraine and the disruption and embargoes on Russian gas supply, the world has been scrambling for natural gas. And part of the driver of that was underinvestment before that invasion happened. And I think there were a lot of assumptions about when the use of natural gas or other fuels would peak. But at the end of the day, countries looking for sustainable baseload, countries in the Indo-Pacific trying to give more of their citizens access to low emission or just energy period, electricity period. There's still many countries in the Indo-Pacific with rolling blackouts, India included, that is the role coal has come in to fill. And as gas has become less available, coal has gone up. And so I think it's a high priority, both from a security standpoint of who's going to be a friend to these countries and for the environment to get more LNG to them.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I note that countries throughout the Indo-Pacific region have increased coal burning to produce electricity. I think of countries like Taiwan that currently burn coal to produce electricity. I think of Japan's energy challenges. I know that Japan recently instructed, the government of Japan recently instructed large LNG purchasers, I believe Mitsubishi, to secure long-term LNG contracts. So do you think it should be a priority, a foreign policy priority, of the whole of the government of Canada to make the export of LNG to allies and partners across the Indo-Pacific region, such as Taiwan, such as Japan, Australia, and others, a priority?
I do, and I think it's a priority because the alternative is a rapprochement of those countries to other jurisdictions, a diminished influence for Canada in those regions. And at the end of the day, we have the resource. We have the capacity as a country to fill those needs, and those countries know it. And we don't really have a good reason for not coming in and playing that role, especially when we look at the domestic benefits that include those important reconciliation and job benefits in Canada, 77,000 jobs if we build a majority of those projects that we have under construction right now. Well, not all under construction, but in development, Silisms, LNG Canada, Cedar, wood fiber.
Thank you. I have a question for the Canadian Cattle, formerly the Cattlemen's Association, about what we need to do, what your recommendations are for us to increase beef exports to the Indo-Pacific region. I referenced in the earlier panel how the Dutch are almost exporting double agriculture and agri-food exports that we are. According to the data I have, they exported $15 billion in meat last year, Canadian dollars, worth of meat last year, and we exported $9.3 billion in meat last year. So what do we need to do to catch up and exceed the Dutch when it comes to exporting meat products like Canadian beef?
Well, thanks for the question. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's obviously a multifaceted answer. To be clear, the beef industry in Canada has been challenged over the last couple of years, 3-4 years at least, with some pretty debilitating droughts. That has really commanded the direction of our cow herd. But yet, we've been able to make advances in the yield of beef per animal. So I would say investing in those very high quality trade agreements such as the CPTPP. That agreement has yielded just huge benefits to Canadian cattle producers, in particular in markets like Japan and Vietnam. The highest growth potential, and ones that we've actually realized over the course of the last 5 years. I wanted to just accentuate the fact that it needs to be the high quality side. The alternative, if we don't meet that bar that CPTPP has set, it quite simply amounts to really nothing. The details really are critical, and I would focus on a science and rules-based trade agreement.
Thank you, Mr. Chong. We'll now go to Mr. Fragasatos for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. Mr. Fulton, I am interested in what you just said on trade. Could you expand a little bit more about how CPTPP has helped your sector?
Yeah, in particular, the Japanese market is number 2 on our list of high value markets of export destinations for Canadian beef, and continues to represent one of the top priorities. In particular, the difference that CPTPP made to that market was that it put us in a better competitive position based on a lower tariff rate than our competitors. And then when our competitors actually were, in some instances, were able to meet the same tariff rate, we actually grew demand in that country by virtue of the fact that the landed price of high quality beef is lower. And so it's it's really kind of a multifaceted thing. But the another destination that I would point to is Vietnam. We really had very limited access and interest from Vietnam before CPTPP, and now I would count that as really one of the top 5 destinations for our product.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Vietnam is not frequently mentioned when it comes to powers in that part of the world, but they are really an emerging economy that has done extremely well. Look, I'm just thrilled to hear that this trade agreement has helped you in the way that it has. Can you go back to the point, though, that you made in reference to one of my colleague, Mr. Chong's questions about science? I didn't quite get it. You were talking about CPTPP, and I think you were talking about it as kind of like the gold standard for your sector, but then you pivoted to talk about science in some way. I just wanted you to repeat it just for my understanding.
Sure, yeah. So in particular, I referenced in my opening comments the WOA, World Organization for Animal Health, sets guidelines on really how science should intersect with trade, and those, along with WTO rules, are really what set the stage for Canada, for a country like Canada that arguably can't wield the political power to access some of these markets. We rely on those rules that define playing field to really be able to access that. And if they don't meet those standards, for example, the UK's accession into desire to ascend into the CPTPP, in our opinion, has not met that standard, and which is why we've been very public in opposing their accession into that agreement, because it would diminish the quality, really, of that agreement.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Landsbergen, thank you very much as well for being here, obviously, tonight. Very interesting list of numbers, list of figures that you cited from a data perspective. That's always very helpful to the committee. China obviously is very important for those that you represent. But what would happen, and I'm offering you a hypothetical, from the political perspective, it's never a good idea to answer hypothetical, so I'm putting you in a difficult position. I'm sure it's the same in your neck of the woods, so to speak. But regardless, I think it is an important and relevant question. What we heard from the Cattle Association is that the relations right now are troubled. There's difficulties in terms of not just difficulties, huge challenges, a huge problem for beef exporters with respect to China, for reasons that appear to be quite arbitrary, to put it mildly. What would happen if China did the same thing to your sector? How would your sector respond? Would you look for, and are you actively looking for other markets to prepare for that possibility, should it ever arise?
Our companies in our sector have been trying to diversify beyond our key markets for quite some time, whether it be China or even trying to balance out the importance of the U.S. economy. When it comes to China, and I sympathize with my friends here in the beef sector, during COVID, a lot of our commodity sectors, myself and cattle and beef and pork, were engaged with our government almost on a weekly basis to discuss how China was implementing their new decrees. And I think that sets a great example of how we need to respond to circumstances that don't appear to follow the trade rules. Now, it hasn't worked for beef, unfortunately. We've heard about whether we should file claims to the WTO, but I know from previous experience that's a long process, and it doesn't yield results right away. So the more we can prevent the issues and resolve them through better bilateral relationship is always better.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Frangasatos. Now to Monsieur Perron for 6 minutes.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thanks to the witnesses for being here this evening. It's a pleasure to see you here. Mr. Fulton, Ms. Babcock, I'd like to talk to you about access to the European market, and I'd just like to draw a parallel here. Mr. Fulton just alluded to this. Can you hear the interpretation? Testing, testing. I'd like to talk about the European market. You just alluded to the UK and its potential membership of the new Trans-Pacific Partnership. And now we're talking about non-tariff barriers. This could also occur in Asia if we're not careful. You just talked about China that's still blocking your imports in a completely arbitrary fashion, from what I understand. So as parliamentarians, what can we do when we sign an agreement? And you remember that we're supposed to have substantial access to the European market, but it doesn't work when it comes to cleaning carcasses, for example. But when it comes to scientific issues, there's supposed to be a standards reciprocity. There's supposed to be equivalencies. What can we do as parliamentarians to ensure that in the development of the Asia-Pacific market, we don't end up with non-tariff barriers like those? Are there any precautions that we can take specifically?
Thank you so much for your question. Sorry, I don't understand French well enough to follow you. But I would say unequivocally the details of these trade agreements matter, and specifically the dispute settlement mechanisms matter. We've had experience, positive experience with the WTO dispute settlement mechanisms in addressing some of these non-tariff trade barriers. And what we have found is that those mechanisms can set precedents that set the tone of trade going forward. That said, specifically with CETA, that agreement from a beef standpoint has failed to meet our the bar of quality agreements exactly for the non-tariff barriers that you've mentioned, referencing carcass washes, and we continue to work through, but some of those details. But to be honest, there seems to be another barrier that comes into play when we think we've just got one resolved. So it's frustrating.
Qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire?
What could we do in addition to what we're currently doing? What could we do in addition to what we're currently doing to help you get access to markets such as the Chinese market? Do you get the sense that Canada is standing up for itself sufficiently in these circumstances? Is Canada standing up to recalcitrant trade partners such as Europe when it comes to non-tariff trade barriers, or China for reasons that are completely arbitrary?
So to really go back to our agreement, or my original statement relating to our suggestion that we believe that our industry believes that we should start looking into the possibility of taking trade action against China to address this issue. As I said, we've had experience with this in the past, unfortunately, and so we're already starting to have those conversations.
Puis vous avez pas peur que...
And you're not afraid that were we to take the kind of measures that you're suggesting, retaliatory ones vis-a-vis China, that it might have an impact on other commodities, such as the fisheries, that don't have any access issues currently? This is a bit of a sensitive issue, isn't it?
Yes, it's very much a sensitive issue, and actually, as part of some of those conversations, we've talked to some of the other commodity groups, ag commodity groups, in relaying this concern that we have and appreciating the fact that there is a possible risk associated with that going forward.
C'est bien.
Well, good. Thank you very much for those answers. Mr. Landsbergen, I'm curious to know, I don't have much time left, but you export a lot, but it's been brought to my attention that it's difficult to get access to Canadian markets domestically or in Quebec, for example, because you export more, it's more profitable to export more, and so all of these goods are going abroad for the large part. Is there a way of enhancing access for the local population of this top quality product, which is why it sells so well in the first place? Well, thank you very much for the question.
Quickly, yes, 70% of our domestic market is served by imported product. Salmon is a third of that, of the market, and it's, imported farm salmon. A quarter of it is imported shrimp, which is the larger species, warm water species, whether it be wild or farmed. So we need to, certainly on that one, we need to encourage Canadians to eat the smaller cold water shrimp. And tuna is the next largest product by volume, and we don't have a large tuna fishery in Canada. Over the last 2 years, we have had a national marketing campaign to try and encourage Canadians to eat more Canadian seafood and broaden out their appetite to include more of the species we have here in Canada. And it's an ever-ending process.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perron. Can we just pause for a second? Mr. Fulton, is your earpiece now working? It's good? Okay, thank you. Very good. Let's go then to Ms. McPherson for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. Oh, let me turn on my video here. Thank you for all of your information so far today. This has been very interesting. Just one point I would point out to Mr. Landsberg, and I know that there are some products that it is very difficult for Canadians to access. Dungeness crab is one of the ones that I've heard multiple times from people, from producers in the West Coast, that they say that it's much more profitable for them to send those products abroad. And I guess I'll start with you on some of my questions. We have, with the Indo-Pacific strategy, we do have an Indo-Pacific Agriculture Office that has been set up. There's been funds that have been allocated to it. It's a 5-year agreement that's been put into place. This was just started this February. There is no similar office for the blue economy that we have as a priority within the Indo-Pacific strategy. What would it mean to your sector to have that be part of the Indo-Pacific strategy, part of the commitment that Canada is making in the region?
Thank you for that question. So in terms of the Indo-Pacific strategy and certainly Agriculture Canada's role, and with the new office in Manila, it does include all agri-food, including fish and seafood. So we will be benefiting from their activities. Yes, we may be in some ways a poor second cousin, where we're going to be a small part of the broader agri-food, and we understand that. But we will have access to their attention and services. And on your point about domestic supply, it is true that we export some of our products to global markets because there's a better price. Unfortunately, Canadians are quite price sensitive when it comes to fish and seafood.
Thank you. And perhaps I'll just ask a very similar question to Mr. Fulton. Mr. Fulton, the IP Agriculture Office, have you seen benefits from that so far? Do you see that as providing something that you need? And what can we do? What recommendations would you make to ensure that it's meeting the needs of your organization better?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just to reference some of our own data with respect to market development, we see a for our own producer dollars put into it, we get a payback of 5 to 1. So these, the way I think I see it is, we see these offices really as a way to further leverage some of those investments that we're already making, and really help address issues as they come up. I will say I think it's critical to really view it as access to the region, to the whole region. For example, South Korea we see as one of the top priorities in terms of opportunities for expanding market share of Canadian beef.
Thank you. Well, and Mr. Fulton, as you may not know, I'm an Albertan, so obviously, beef is a big part of that. I should actually mention that somebody has just let me know that the Oilers are up 2-0. So, in case anyone is interested, in the playoffs. When you talk about, when I think about Alberta though, and the involvement of our beef industry, one of the things that I wonder if that agriculture office could do better is engage better with, provide more opportunity for provincial governments to engage across the country, but obviously those that are more affected within that office. Is that something that you could see the federal government having a role to play?
Honestly, it's such an early at such an early stage in the announcement, like in the use of that office, that I think it's kind of too early to tell. What I will say is that I'll echo the comments that I heard earlier from our colleagues in the canola industry, and that this region is built on long-term relationships, and so. A term agreement of this office being in place for 5 years really just likely scratches the surface in terms of being able to really benefit from its investment.
So really, the idea that it be long term, and I mean, I would assume there could be nothing but benefit in ensuring that other levels of government are able to access those same resources and build those relationships, those long term relationships.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I will say it's very common to see disruptions to trade, and it impacts different parts of the country differently. And we really kind of pride ourselves in being able to pivot to really optimize the situations and the conditions that we're dealt with.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's all for me, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson. We'll now go to Mr. Perkins for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm used to seeing you over on the other side in Fisheries Committee. So I represent, for those who don't know, one of the, in my view, and I think statistically true, one of the most important fishing ridings in the country, the South Shore of Nova Scotia. So everyone, I think, who knows that will be shocked to learn that most of my questions here from Mr. Landenbergen, who is a regular at the Fisheries Committee where I'm a member. 80% of what we catch in wild seafood is exported. 70% of what we consume is imported. That seems to be a strange combination that we all grapple with. But there is high demand, obviously, in Asia for our seafood products, and it has grown over the years. I'd just like to talk a bit about that challenge on diversification, because as China in particular engages in buying up businesses in Canada and everywhere in the world, one of the ways they're getting access to our seafood products is actually buying up those who buy the fish from the fishermen so that they can control where it goes and being exported. And we have a particular challenge in Nova Scotia where they also control the live seafood export facility at the Halifax Airport run by First Catch. So I'm just wondering, how is it, and how, as one of the spokesmen for industry, the industry that's so important, you can diversify within the region when one particular member is actually sort of doing an end around and trying to get control of the supply chain in Canada, and we're letting it happen.
That's a very good question, Mr. Chair. In terms of diversification, I think In our sector, more than many others, the customer-supplier relationship really is so personal. Others have talked about long-term benefits of having an office in country. Many of our bigger companies, they have sales people in country, in China, in US, in Japan, in Europe, and other countries in Asia. We need more to do that. Some of it is through marketing agents as well. And some of our members, they're traveling months and months of the year to meet with their customers. So I think that is really important. How we manage China or other companies, and whether they be state-owned companies or not, how they buy up and invest in our industry needs to be balanced. Sometimes companies, regardless of how they're owned, are good actors and others are not. And so we have to balance that with the rules that we have in place. And the Canada Investment Act might not necessarily be good enough for our sector.
You should know that we've changed, thanks to amendments I made to the Canada Investment Act that have just been proclaimed, that the threshold for state-owned enterprises for countries we don't have a bilateral relationship with, the threshold for review by Investment Canada is now $0. In other words, every acquisition can get reviewed. But were you consulted, or your organization consulted, on the development of this strategy?
On the Indo-Pacific strategy, yes.
And do you see any of what the industry needs reflected in the strategy?
Really, I think the difficult part for us, because for agri-food, a lot of the strategy was driven by Agriculture Canada, that seafood is a small part of the broader portfolio. And so we were very pleased to be consulted, to be invited to participate in the industry working group.
Illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, particularly in the international oceans, is a major issue, particularly in Asia. How is it possible to have a successful Indo-Pacific strategy if the countries from that region are breaking most international rules in their fishing in international waters and what they do with that product?
To really tackle IUU fishing, and we recognize there are definitely hotspots, much as you just said, it's multifaceted, and it takes every country and certainly every major seafood consuming jurisdiction to use multi tools to address that, whether it be the Port States Measures Act or other specific issues to really try and prevent IUU products from getting into market.
Does the strategy address that at all?
I'd have to take a closer look, but I would think it would be a minor part of the overall strategy because, again, seafood is a small part of it. There's other tools that governments have.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. Looks like we'll have to have Mr. Landsberg come back to our committee to have this discussion a little bit further then. Let's go to Mr. Erskine-Smith for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much. I want to ask my questions of Ms. Joseph, and I want to get at the role of LNG and I suppose natural gas in general, in your view, not just in the short term, but the long term. Because when we talk about a business case for natural gas, are we talking about it in the context of a net zero world?
Yes. So, Japan has the same climate targets, very similar climate targets as Canada, as does South Korea. But, as I pointed out in my comments, those are countries that import over close to 90% of their energy. And for them, security supply is a huge issue. And while all of them are looking at diverse energy sources like integration of wind, solar, et cetera, integration of hydrogen, the supply isn't there yet. Renewables need to be backstopped.
Well, not yet. But so I'm not talking about the next few years, and security in the short term is different from net zero in the long term.
Sure.
And so when we think of a net zero world by 2050, what role do you see for natural gas?
So I don't think 2050 is that long term away in terms of how fast energy systems change. Canada has increased its electricity supply domestically by 9% between 2005 and 2022. Some of these countries, as I mentioned, are just trying to get their societies electrified, period, let alone electrify sectors that have never been electrified, let alone maintain affordability of energy, et cetera. So 2050, I don't think is the timeline for natural gas to not be needed. It's still going to be critically important, including for the integration of renewables.
So on that, this is not me saying this. This is the International Energy Agency. They've got three different scenarios. They've got a stated policy scenario, in which case we do see an increase. So if just the policies that are announced today and in place today, if they stay today, then we're going to see an increase in natural gas from 3,900 billion cubic meters to 5,700 by 2050. In the announced pledges, though, countries that have just announced their targets, they've got to implement them. We see a slight increase and then flatlining all the way to 2050. We don't see a major increase to 2050. But here's what I want to ask you about. In the net zero scenario, we see a 55% decline in natural gas demand. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that's a model of what a world could look like in one version of getting to net zero. And that's true for the Canada Energy Regulator scenario as well. But those scenarios also anticipate an overall decline in energy use, which we are not on track for, especially as, the continent of Africa.
Us being on track to something is different from getting to net zero. We are not on track to getting to net zero. But this is, I think, the core question. If we work towards a world that is net zero, if we are committed to that, what is the role for natural gas? And if you disagree with the IEA, it's not a 55% decline. What decline is it in your view?
I don't know what the number is. The number is going to depend on alternative sources of energy being available to countries to provide their populations with affordable energy. And until those other sources of supply ramp up, it's a guess. The IEA is guessing too.
But it's not an answer on net zero, right? Because you're talking about...
It's an answer on net zero, talking about the things energy needs to deliver for people. And the IEA is projecting that. I don't have the answer to what the world...
So it's an answer to delivering affordable energy potentially, but it's not an answer to net zero. Now, what the IEA will say, or what they do say, is the electricity sector will be the first to achieve net zero emissions, mainly because of the low cost, widespread policy support, and maturity of an array of renewable energy technologies. And electricity renewables are going to make up 90% by 2050 on the IEA's analysis. So it's hard for me, I suppose, to take altogether seriously the role that natural gas is to play by 2050. If I'm looking at modeled costed numbers from the IEA, and the answer back on your end, where there's a business case, is to say, but we don't know.
I guess I would just point out that it's modeled, but when you look at what's actually happening in the world, how fast you can do renewables penetration, the available of batteries that deal with intermittency. You can't do that. It's not, I don't know, it's 25 years. But 25 years.
But then you don't believe in a net zero world. You don't believe in a net zero world.
There can be a net zero world. I don't believe in your description.
Point of order, Chair.
Two things. First of all, when you both talk at once, it makes it impossible for our interpreters to keep up, okay? And secondly, Mr. Erskine-Smith, you are out of time. Let's go to, shall we, Mr. Bergeron for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Well, it was quite a spectacle to listen to all of that without being able to chime in. Now, I'd like to thank my colleague, Yves Perron, for having been here this evening to support me during this particular meeting, which deals with agricultural issues that he's our critic on, and he's an expert on these matters. Now, I'd like to continue, Mr. Lansbury, along the same lines as Mr. Perron, regarding the fact that in many cases, producers prefer to export their commodities rather than having them consumed or used locally. First question, what could be done to address that? And secondly, we know that there's a whole host of products in Asian countries that are consumed there that we just quite simply don't eat here, and that are in fact thrown away in the ocean, or how can we develop those markets? These are products that are less popular in the West but may be very popular in the East. How can we further develop those markets? Well, thank you for the question.
Difficult one. Our sector is so fragmented, so diverse, with so many different species. It's very difficult for us to come together to have a national marketing campaign, much like you see with milk, chickens, eggs. Like, we're not supply managed either, so we don't have a marketing levy that supports the marketing efforts. And so we. Sometimes we rely on partnerships with some of the retailers to promote domestic product. I know in Quebec, Metro, which has a big presence in Quebec, they market Quebec products, Produit DC. And when I look at those flyers and in store, I'm proud of that. We need more of that, but it's a whole supply chain issue.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. That is your time, sir. We'll go to Ms. McPherson now for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I think I'd like to continue on some of the questions that my colleague, Mr. Erskine-Smith, has been asking of Ms. Joseph. And it's interesting for me as well, listening to the back and forth, because I was part of a delegation that went and met with the German government last year, and they spoke about the desire for Canadian natural gas, but they also spoke about that as being a short-term thing, that they needed to help with the crisis in Ukraine, the illegal invasion by Russia, but there wasn't a long-term goal for them. That long term, they had much more interest in hydrogen, much more interest in renewables, much less interest in that. And yet the infrastructure to build so that we can actually develop these relationships on natural gas take a really long time, and they're extraordinarily expensive. And so if we had them, that would be one thing. But without the, I'm cautious about the idea of being energy for a secure future, but it doesn't seem like you have as much openness to renewable energy, to the various forms of hydrogen. How does that fit into energy for a secure future in the region? And I also wanted to just point out too, it feels to me like we can't look at energy transition as like a straight trajectory. There is going to be a difference in how renewables come online, how actual, clean energy comes online, because I agree with you, we need energy for the world. I'm wondering if you could just respond to that.
Sure. So I 100% agree that, I've heard those same things from Germany, and every country's approach to both achieving their energy goals and their emissions targets are going to be different. And every country is starting somewhere different. And so I think we're very neutral as to how that's done. There are people within our network with a focus on hydrogen. There are people with our network on a focus in various types of energy overall. I spoke a lot about LNG because I think it is the resource where we have the capacity to meet the thing that is backstopping renewables now, not in Canada and internationally. That's something, Robert Johnston from Columbia University has highlighted. So it supports the transition. I think that LNG is something that people are signing contracts for into that time frame of 2050. And so is it us, or is it our LNG or someone else's, or are they going to be looking for baseload from other jurisdictions that are not us, or are they going to use more coal, which is what a lot of these countries have done, including Germany?
Or could we help them invest more in actual green energy and actual renewables that would help get those countries and would provide those opportunities for Canada as well?
We will have to leave
I
the
realize
answer
I am
to
out
that.
of time,
Yes,
however,
you are
because
out
I
of
have
time.
a short window.
Yeah, well, as the evening goes on, everybody gets more energetic. This is very good. So this is what we're going to do. In the time remaining, we'll go to Mr. Couric, Mr. Oliphant, then back to Mr. Bergeron and Ms. McPherson to round up. Mr. Couric, 5 minutes to you, sir.
Thanks very much, and Ms. Joseph, I really appreciate what you've shared here because it's reasonable and realistic in terms of talking about an energy future that is based on what the world needs, not a pipe dream, not a fantasy, which I regret that quite often seems to be what bleeds from other political parties across the aisle. So I want to ask you very specifically. When it comes to reducing global emissions, is there a case for Canadian LNG to be part of that solution?
Yes. So because the world has been increasing its use of coal, and it's increasing its use of coal because it wants a high volume, low cost source of energy. The alternative to that has a lot of the same characteristics, but half the emissions, is natural gas. And LNG from Canada, which would be made with some of the highest methane, some of the highest emission mitigation. Many of the projects that are coming online are going to be electrified. So the lowest emission is how it's produced, going to displace these higher emitting fuels, which these countries continue to use. As I said, India has plans to double coal production by 2030, which is all for electricity generation. So that means major emissions increases, much more significant than Canada's emissions. And we have to look at what role can we play in that.
So the way that I see it is Canada can be left behind, and the world has the world's environment is worse off, or we can lead the world by making sure that we can get our energy to market. Now, I would ask, specifically when it comes to hydrogen, because I think there's this misnomer that it's hydrogen or natural gas. Can you comment on that it's not a binary thing, but it's hydrogen and natural gas? Could you comment on that quickly?
It's absolutely hydrogen and natural gas, and some of the first hydrogen that's going to come onto market and is starting to be developed in terms of projects, including in Alberta, are blue hydrogen projects that benefit from the carbon capture capacity and resource and geology, but then can be exported as ammonia. And that's an option that also exists, in the East. If people want to pursue it. And then, of course, in Eastern Canada, there's a lot of goals around green hydrogen, the use of wind to produce that. So there is no and or, because the goal is more. And what is going to fill that need for human access to affordable, reliable energy that countries are not compromising on.
And I appreciate that. And the goal is more, I think, is a great message that I hope my colleagues are listening to. And just one quick final question, and then I do hope to get to my friends at the Canadian cattle producers. Much of the tech associated with clean tech, green tech, however it is defined, is produced in jurisdictions with very poor environmental records. Are we accurately accounting for the emissions that go into the production of that technology? Just if you can, 10, 15 seconds. Sorry that it's short.
I don't think there's a lot of discussion about the supply chains and the environmental impacts, not just in terms of emissions, but in terms of water pollution, land, like the mining. There's a lot of environmental impacts associated with.
I hate to cut you off, but let's just leave it there and say more needs to be talked about. To my friends at the cattle producers, the WTO, other trade challenges, I just want to provide in the last minute or so, if you can talk about that, and specifically as a starting point for that, when the interim agreement with the UK was signed, one of your American counterparts, their comment to me was, you all got screwed, at the same time when the Liberals were celebrating the ascension of this agreement. So I'm wondering if just in the last 60 seconds or so, if you can talk about some of the trade challenges that exist and the role that the WTO can play in terms of helping to mitigate some of those challenges within your sector, but if you can broaden it just about your knowledge more generally as well.
Yeah. So as I said, we've utilized the WTO dispute settlement mechanism and have a precedent in one particular instance that we can and do reference when dealing with our trading relationship with really our largest partner. That's one scenario. Another scenario really is really addressing some of these challenges, these non-tariff barriers, right up front, on initiation of these agreements, and working obviously very very much in part with our trade negotiators to ensure that our concerns are being heard, and that we're really being represented in a fair agreement.
Thank you, Mr. Fulton. Mr. Burke. We'll now go to Mr. Oliphant for 5 minutes.
Sorry, I was just unmuting. I'm actually going to pass on my time. I've actually lost the thread of this as the Canada-China Committee, and particularly on the Indo-Pacific strategy. So it has lost relevance for me at this point, and I'm just going to pass on my time. Thank you.
All right, very good. Then we will wrap up then with Mr. Bergeron for 2.5 minutes and Ms. McPherson for 2.5 minutes.
Merci. Alors, j'aimerais...
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to give Mr. Landsbergen an opportunity to respond to the question about the products that are not as popular in the West that might find a marketplace in the East.
Yes, so we do have a variety of different products. For example, clams and whether it be Arctic surf clam in the East or gooey duck in the West. We need to have more promotions of those products so that Canadians can taste the great seafood that we have across all the different species. We had a national marketing campaign the last 2 years to promote those variety of species. The website is still live, chooseseafood.ca. Smarter Meals Out of the Blue is the tagline. And we profiled a number of different species to Canadians, largely millennials in large urban centers, because that allowed us to get the most efficiency in the dollars that we had available.
Et comment développer davantage les marques?
And how can you further develop the Asian markets, i.e. in terms of what they produce?
Sorry, I didn't get the...
Comment développer?
How can you further develop those Asian markets?
For Asia, certainly the new office is a great start. The offices from EDC that will help exporters to facilitate some of the shipments. We have the federal government and the provinces participating in trade missions. And so I think we do need federal and provincial elected officials to also go to these trade missions and trade shows. In Boston, back in March, we had 3 federal ministers, 4 premiers and their fisheries ministers, a 5th fisheries minister, all present in the Boston Seafood Show, which is for North America. If we could get even a part of that representation in Asia trade shows, I think that would be helpful as well.
Thank you, Mr. Landsbergen. Just as a side note, this committee will discuss, in fact, in the fullness of time, perhaps a bit of travel to some of the locations where we're attempting to build markets. We would be talking about that in the future, I'm sure, in the not too distant future, in fact. To wrap us up, we'll go to Ms. McPherson for our final 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the witnesses being here one more time. The final 2.5 minutes. You know what? I'm just going to start. Maybe, Mr. Fulton, is there anything that you would like to see in the final report from this committee on the Indo-Pacific strategy? And I'll just go through all of the witnesses. Mr. Fulton.
Yeah, specifically with respect to any future trade agreements, a focus on science and rules-based trade, as I've referenced before. It's critical for them to be quality for industry.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Landsberg. Bergen?
I think we've got a good start with the Indo-Pacific strategy. We need to continue implementing it and make sure it's long term. 5 years isn't enough.
And probably more investment in that too. Yeah. Thank you, Ms. Joseph.
I think LNG needs to be integrated as a priority in how Canada wants to engage in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that on the emission side, there are lots of opportunities for us to either work within mechanisms like Article 6 of the Paris Agreement or bilaterally with some of those Asian partners on and how those emissions are recognized and those emissions reductions are recognized. And I think all of that is part of a full picture that can be that LNG value proposition.
Certainly, we also need to recognize that the world needs climate action. So that's probably a good place to end today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson, and thank you to our panelists. We've had actually a very full meeting. It's amazing how fast 3 hours can go, correct? Say yes, just nod. All right. Listen, I'd like to thank our clerk, analysts, our interpreters, and all our support staff for making this a very interesting evening. And with that, we will adjourn.